I used to think the worst thing my mother-in-law could do to me was make one more comment about my daughter's coloring. I used to think the worst thing she could do was leave Sophie out of another family photo, or introduce her to a stranger as Michael's little girl instead of my granddaughter. I used to think I had already lived through the worst of Linda Whitfield. I was wrong. The worst thing Linda ever did to our family, she did to herself. And she did it without knowing it, using a plastic tube, a cotton swab, and $1,100 she spent behind everyone's back. She spent 3 years trying to prove that my 5-year-old daughter didn't belong in her family. In the end, all she proved was that she didn't know her own. My name is Rachel. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in a 2-bedroom house with my parents and my younger brother, and I never once in my life thought I would end up the villain in another woman's story just for falling in love with her son. But that's what happened. From the very first Thanksgiving I spent at the Whitfield house in Litchfield County, I understood that Linda had already decided who I was before I ever opened my mouth. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the ending doesn't make sense without it. If I just told you about the DNA test, you'd think Linda was simply a suspicious old woman who got a shock she didn't deserve. But she deserved every bit of what came next. She spent years building the trap. She just aimed it at the wrong person. I met Michael Whitfield when I was 26, waiting tables at a restaurant in New Haven while I finished my degree in occupational therapy. He was a corporate attorney, 10 years into a career his family considered acceptable but not exceptional, which in Whitfield terms meant he hadn't gone into politics or finance, and that alone made him something of a disappointment before I ever came into the picture. He was kind in a quiet way, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He left good tips not because he was performing generosity, but because he genuinely didn't think about money the way people who grew up like me had to think about it. That should have been my first warning, honestly. Not about him, about his family. Money that doesn't have to be thought about is money that comes with expectations attached, even when nobody says so out loud. We dated for 8 months before he brought me home to Litchfield County to meet his parents. I remember the drive up from New Haven, the roads getting narrower and greener, stone walls running along the edges of properties that had clearly belonged to the same families for 200 years. Michael kept glancing at me in the passenger seat, and I kept telling him I was fine, even though my stomach was doing slow, nauseous loops. "They're going to love you," he said, for maybe the 5th time. "You keep saying that like you're trying to convince yourself," I said. He laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. "My mother can be a lot, just don't take anything personally tonight. She warms up. It just takes her a while. It took her 11 years. I want to be precise about that, because a while implies a timeline with an end." Linda Whitfield never warmed up to me. She simply got better at hiding how cold she was, and then, eventually, she stopped hiding it altogether, because by then she thought she had a good enough reason not to. The Whitfield house sat on 4 acres outside a town so small it didn't have a stoplight. A white colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch that had been photographed for a regional magazine once, a fact Linda mentioned within the first 10 minutes of meeting me. The mention was not incidental. Nothing Linda said in those early years was incidental. Every sentence she spoke to me in the first year of knowing me was a small transaction, a way of establishing where I stood in relation to the house, the family, the 4 acres, the 200 years of stone walls. "So you're the one," she said when Michael introduced us, and she looked me over the way you'd look over a used car you already suspected had a bad transmission. "Michael tells us you're from Bridgeport." "Born and raised," I said, trying to sound proud of it, because I was. "How interesting," Linda said, in a tone that made it clear she did not find it interesting at all. "Robert, doesn't Rachel remind you of that girl who used to do our books? The one from Waterbury?" Robert, Michael's father was a tall, stooped man with kind eyes and the general demeanor of someone who had spent 30 years learning that the fastest way through a conversation with his wife was agreement. He said, which I would learn was Robert's answer to almost everything Linda said, a syllable engineered to mean nothing while sounding like something. I want to be fair to Linda. Even now. Even after everything. She wasn't a cartoon. She wasn't cruel in ways you could point to and say, "There, that's abuse. Call the authorities." She was cruel the way January is cold, steadily, without malice exactly, just as a feature of the climate you'd entered. She asked me questions about my family that were phrased as curiosity and functioned as appraisal. What did my father do? Had my parents attended college? Did we still have family back in Mexico? A phrase that assumed things about my family's history that weren't true. My mother's family had been in Bridgeport since the 1970s. My father's family even longer. But Mexico was close enough for Linda. The way the city was close enough for people like Linda when they meant anywhere they hadn't personally been invited. Michael apologized for her in the car on the way home. He did that a lot in the early years. I didn't yet understand that his apologizing for her was its own kind of problem, a signal that he expected this to keep happening and had already made peace with it happening rather than confronting it. "She'll come around," he said. "She's just protective." "Protective of what?" I asked. "You're 36. He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he'd ever asked himself the question. Michael proposed on a Tuesday, which I loved, because it wasn't staged for anyone but us. No restaurant, no ring hidden in a dessert. Just the two of us on the floor of his apartment eating Thai food out of the containers, and him suddenly getting quiet and then getting down on one knee in his socks. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We told his parents on a Sunday phone call, and I remember sitting next to him on the couch, close enough to hear Linda's voice through the speaker, and the half-second pause before she said, "Well, congratulations," in a tone better suited to receiving news of a mild inconvenience, like a delayed flight. "She's happy for us," Michael said afterward, and I let him believe that, because arguing about it wouldn't have changed anything, and I still had some hope in me back then that time would do the work Linda wasn't willing to do herself. The wedding planning became its own education in who Linda actually was, underneath the magazine porch politeness. She had opinions about the guest list. Specifically, she had opinions about the size and composition of my side of the guest list, which she brought up more than once in the framing of logistics, as though my extended family attending my own wedding was a scheduling problem to be solved rather than a fact of the day. "It's just that the Whitfield side alone is going to be 60 people," she said, over a lunch she'd insisted on hosting at a country club I'd never been to and would never be invited back to. "And if your side matches that, we're looking at a tent. And tents get complicated with the Historical Society's noise ordinance." "We can do a tent," I said. "I'm just saying," Linda said, cutting a piece of salmon with more force than salmon requires. "It might be nice to keep things a bit more intimate. Quality over quantity." I told this story to my mother later that week, expecting her to be as offended as I was. Instead, she just laughed, not unkindly, and said, "Mija, that woman is scared of you." I didn't believe her. I thought Linda was condescending toward me, dismissive of me, unimpressed by me, but scared of me, seemed backward. What did I have that a woman like Linda Whitfield could possibly be afraid of? It took me years to understand what my mother meant. Linda wasn't scared of me personally. She was scared of what I represented, which was a version of the future she couldn't fully control. A grandchild who would carry my last name somewhere in the paperwork, even if not on the surname line. A grandchild whose photographs at family events might show up in a family history book looking, God forbid, more like the Alvarez side than the Whitfield side. Linda had built her entire adult identity around the idea of the Whitfield line. Not just the money, though there was money, a modest trust and a business that had done well in textiles 2 generations back and then coasted comfortably ever since. But the idea of the line itself. Who counted as a Whitfield and who didn't? She had a genealogy chart, framed in the front hallway, going back to a man named Josiah Whitfield, who had apparently come over on a ship in 1638, and every person who married into the family after that was, in some private ledger Linda kept in her head, a kind of asterisk next to the real names. We got married in October, at a stone chapel not far from the Whitfield house, 62 people on Michael's side and 41 on mine, no tent, and it rained, which my mother said was good luck, and Linda said was unfortunate, given the flowers. My father walked me down the aisle in a suit he'd rented and pressed himself the night before, and I remember looking past him at the front row, where Linda sat with her hands folded, dry-eyed, watching me the way you'd watch a stock ticker for a company you'd already decided to sell. Robert cried, actually, which surprised me. He hugged me afterward and said, "Welcome to the family, sweetheart," and meant it, I think, in the uncomplicated way that quiet men sometimes mean the things they say, precisely because they say so few of them. Linda hugged me too, briefly, a hug with air between our bodies the whole time, and said, "Well, I suppose it's official now," in a voice that made the word official sound like a technicality rather than a celebration. I told myself, standing there in my wedding dress with rain still in my hair, that this was as good as it was going to get with Linda, and that I could live with that, because I hadn't married Linda. I'd married Michael. I didn't yet understand that in a family like the Whitfields, you don't get to just marry the one person. You marry the whole apparatus, whether it wants you or not. Sophie was born on a March morning 3 years later, after 11 hours of labor and one moment near the end where I genuinely believed I would not survive it. And then, all at once, I did survive it. And there she was, red-faced and furious and perfect. And Michael was crying into my shoulder, and I remember thinking, this is the best thing I will ever do. No matter what else happens in my life, I have already done the best thing. Linda came to the hospital the next day with a gift bag from a boutique in Litchfield, and a look on her face I couldn't quite place at the time, but have thought about many times since. She held Sophie for exactly as long as etiquette required and not a second longer, and she studied her. Not the way you study a baby, cataloging the small features, the eyelashes, the fingernails, but the way you study a document you suspect might be a forgery. "She has a lot of hair," Linda said. "She does," I said, delighted, because Sophie had come out with a thick head of dark hair, the kind of hair that made the nurses coo. "Michael was bald as an egg until he was 2, Linda said, handing Sophie back to me with what I registered, even through the fog of postpartum exhaustion, as relief. Just bald as an egg. I didn't think much of it in the moment. New grandmothers say strange things. I'd heard enough stories from friends to know that childbirth brings out odd commentary in the older generation, comments about noses and chins and who a baby takes after. Comments that are mostly harmless, mostly just people trying to locate a brand new person within the family they already know. It was only later, once the comments kept coming, once they developed a pattern instead of remaining scattered, that I understood Linda's remark in the hospital room hadn't been odd new grandmother chatter. It had been the opening entry in a ledger she would keep for the next 5 years. Sophie grew into a beautiful child with my mother's deep brown eyes, my father's stubborn chin, and skin a shade or two darker than Michael's, closer to my own coloring, which made sense, because I am half her genetic material, and my genes for pigmentation are not shy. She had Michael's laugh, though, the exact same wheezing, delighted, undignified laugh The kind of laugh that made strangers on the street turn and smile. She had his long fingers. She had, if you looked closely, his mother's stubbornness, which was frankly the single most Whitfield thing about her, though Linda would have been furious to hear me say so. Linda didn't see any of that. Linda saw a baby who didn't look enough like the framed photographs in the front hallway, and she began, almost immediately, in small ways, to treat Sophie as a kind of guest in the family rather than a member of it. The first time I really noticed it, Sophie was 18 months old, at a 4th of July gathering at the lake house. The Whitfields owned a modest cottage on a lake 40 minutes from the main house, another property that had been in the family for generations, another place where the walls were lined with photographs of Whitfields going back to black and white prints of men in stiff collars. Linda was arranging the extended family for a photo on the dock. Robert, Michael's brother Chris and his wife Amanda and their son Tyler, who was then about 3, Michael and me and Sophie, Linda's sister Patricia and her husband. "Tyler, come stand by Grandma," Linda called, arranging bodies like a director blocking a scene. "Chris, you there?" Amanda, next to him. Michael, why don't you hold Sophie a little more toward the front? There, that's... No, Rachel, if you could just step back a touch. I want to make sure we get the whole dock in the shot. It was such a small thing. Step back a touch. But when I look at that photograph now, and I have looked at it many times since, in the weeks after everything fell apart, I am standing at the very edge of the frame, one shoulder cut off entirely, while Tyler is front and center in Linda's lap, and Sophie is somewhere in the middle distance, being held by Michael at an angle that puts most of his body between her and the camera, so that in the finished photograph, you can see maybe a third of my daughter's face. I didn't say anything that day. I told myself I was being paranoid, that grandmothers naturally gravitate toward the child they've known longer. Tyler had a year's head start on Sophie and Linda's life, and that reading conspiracy into doc photography was the kind of thing insecure new mothers did. I want to be honest about that in telling you this story. I spent years talking myself out of what I was seeing, because the alternative, believing that my daughter's own grandmother had already, quietly, decided she was less real than her cousin, was too ugly a thing to hold on to if I didn't have to. But the pattern didn't stop. It accumulated. Daniel didn't sleep that night. I heard him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and when I came downstairs, he was sitting at the table with the lab report in front of him, staring at it like it might rearrange itself into something less painful if he looked hard enough. "I keep thinking there has to be an explanation," he said without looking up. "Some reason that makes this make sense." "There isn't one, Daniel. There's no version of this where it's okay that your mother took hair off our sleeping daughter's head and sent it to a lab because she didn't trust me." "I know." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I know, Em. I'm not defending her. I've never seen this coming. Not once in 9 years did I think my mother would do something like this." We agreed that night that we would confront her together, calmly, and find out exactly what had happened and why. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to drive to her house at 3 in the morning and demand answers standing in her foyer in my pajamas. But Daniel asked me to wait until we could do it as a united front, in daylight, without Grace anywhere nearby, and I agreed, mostly because I trusted him, and partly because some small, rational part of me knew that showing up unhinged would only give Patricia a way to make this about my reaction instead of her actions. We went to her house 2 days later on a Saturday, after dropping Grace off at my mother's for a sleepover. Gerald was out at a doctor's appointment, which I suspect Patricia had timed on purpose, whether consciously or not. I don't think she wanted her husband in the room for this conversation any more than we did. She opened the door already looking wary, which told me she'd sensed something was wrong from the tone of Daniel's phone call asking to come by. She was wearing a cardigan over a blouse, her hair perfectly set as always, and she led us into the living room with the kind of forced hospitality that made the whole scene feel even more surreal. Offering us tea, fussing with a plate of cookies, as if we'd come for a pleasant Saturday visit instead of what was about to happen. Daniel didn't sit down. He set the folded lab report on the coffee table between them and said, in a voice I'd never heard him use with his mother before, flat and hard, "We need to talk about this." I watched something shift in Patricia's face the moment she saw the envelope. Not surprise, exactly, because I don't think she was surprised that we'd found it. It was more like resignation, like a woman who had been waiting for a knock on the door she knew was eventually coming. "I can explain," she said. "Then explain," Daniel said. "Explain why you took our daughter's hair and a used tissue and sent them to a lab to test whether she's biologically related to you. Explain why you did that behind our backs, without asking either of us, like we're suspects in some kind of investigation." Patricia's hands folded in her lap, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything at all. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual crispness. It sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I had my reasons," she said. "Reasons that have nothing to do with either of you. Not really." "That's not an answer," I said. It was the first time I'd spoken since we sat down, and my voice came out sharper than I intended. "Patricia, you tested my daughter's DNA without my consent. Without Daniel's consent. That's not a small thing. That's not a misunderstanding we can smooth over with tea and cookies. I need you to actually explain yourself." She looked at me then, and there was something in her expression I'd never seen before. Not the cool superiority I was used to, but something closer to fear. "You wouldn't understand," she said quietly. "Try me," I said. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. When she finally spoke again, it wasn't an explanation so much as a confession dressed up as a defense. "There have been questions in this family," she said carefully, "about bloodlines, for a long time. Longer than you know. I needed to be sure. For my own peace of mind, I needed to be absolutely sure that Grace was that she really belonged to this family the way she's supposed to." "She's Daniel's daughter," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "There has never been one single question about that. Not from me, not from Daniel, not from anyone except you. You made this question up out of nothing and used my child to answer it." "You don't understand the pressure," Patricia said, and now there was an edge of something almost pleading in her voice, which was so unlike her that it actually stopped me for a moment. "You don't understand what it means in a family like this to have any doubt at all about who belongs and who doesn't. I needed to know. I needed to be certain, for everyone's sake." "For everyone's sake? Or for yours?" Daniel asked. His voice had gone very quiet, which somehow felt more dangerous than if he'd been shouting. "Because from where I'm standing, Mom, this has nothing to do with Grace or Emily. This is about something you're not telling us." I didn't understand at the time how right he was. I thought Daniel was just angry, grasping for some deeper motive to make sense of an act that otherwise seemed purely cruel. I didn't yet understand that there was, in fact, something else going on, something Patricia had buried so deep, for so long, that even accusing her own daughter-in-law of infidelity was, in a strange and twisted way, easier for her than confronting what she actually feared. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Patricia said finally, straightening her spine, some of her old composure returning even as her eyes stayed wet. "I did what I felt I needed to do. The results confirmed what you've always said was true. I don't see why that isn't the end of this conversation." "Because you violated our daughter," I said, and my voice cracked on the word daughter in a way that surprised me. "Because you didn't ask. Because for 4 years you've been treating me like a suspect in my own marriage, and I let it go because I thought you were just old-fashioned and difficult, and it turns out you were building a case against me the entire time. That is not something I can just move past because the results happen to come back the way they were always going to come back." Patricia's jaw tightened. "I think you're being dramatic," she said, and just like that, the old Patricia was back, cool and dismissive, as though the moment of fear I'd seen in her face had never happened at all. "It was a piece of hair and a tissue. It's not as though I did anything invasive." "It's not about invasive," Daniel said. "It's about trust. You didn't trust my wife. You didn't trust me, apparently, since you never once asked me if I had any doubts. Because I never did. You went around both of us to satisfy some paranoia you won't even explain, and now you're acting like we're the ones overreacting." We left 20 minutes later without any real resolution. Patricia refused to apologize in any way that felt genuine. She offered a clipped, "I'm sorry you're upset," which is not the same thing as being sorry for what you did, and both Daniel and I knew it. We drove home mostly in silence, both of us shaken in different ways. Daniel kept saying, "There's something she's not telling us," and I kept saying, "I don't care what her reasons are. This isn't okay." And we were both right, though it would take weeks before we understood just how right Daniel was about the first part. When Sophie was 2, Linda started a project with the local historical society, a formal genealogy binder documenting 4 centuries of Whitfields in Litchfield County, meant to be donated to the society's archive and displayed eventually in a small exhibit. She spent an entire year on it, tracking down marriage certificates and land deeds and old portraits, cross-referencing names against the framed chart in the front hallway, adding branches for every marriage, every birth, every Whitfield who had ever drawn breath since Josiah stepped off that ship in 1638. She added Tyler to the binder the month he was born. I know this because Amanda, my sister-in-law, mentioned it casually one Christmas, not realizing it would land on me the way it did. "Linda already has Tyler's whole page done," Amanda said, flipping through a draft copy Linda had left on the coffee table. "Look, she's even got his birth weight in here." I looked. Tyler had a full page, his birth date, his birth weight, a baby photo, a line connecting him up through Chris to Robert's father to the Revolutionary-era Whitfields. Sophie, who was 6 months old at that point, had nothing. Not a placeholder, not a blank page reserved for later. Nothing at all, as though she didn't exist. "I'm sure she just hasn't gotten to Sophie's section yet," Michael said, when I brought it up in the car that night, using the same tone he'd used about the guest list, about the doc photo, about every single thing his mother did that required an explanation instead of an apology. "She finished Tyler's section the month he was born," I said. "Sophie is 6 months old. There's been time. You're reading into it." "I am reading into it because there is something to read." He didn't argue with that, exactly, but he didn't agree either, and I remember feeling, for the first time, a small crack open up between us. Not a fight, nothing dramatic, just the quiet recognition that Michael's instinct, when it came to his mother, was always going to be to look for an innocent explanation before he looked at the evidence, and that this instinct was going to cost me something over the years. A small tax paid out of my own patience, again and again, for as long as we were married. The binder was finished by the time Sophie turned 3. I saw the final version at a family dinner. Linda had brought it to show Patricia, laid it out on the dining room table like a museum piece. Tyler had 2 full pages by then, an update section with photos from his 4th birthday, a hand-drawn note about the Whitfield nose, which Tyler did not actually have, Tyler having inherited Amanda's small upturned nose, but which Linda had written in anyway, the way you write in the story you want, rather than the one that's true. Sophie had one paragraph, tucked into a section titled Extended Family, which also included Patricia's husband's cousin who none of us had ever met, and a family friend from the church who'd been an honorary aunt for 30 years. The paragraph read, "Michael and Rachel welcomed a daughter in March. She is a happy, healthy child. No birth weight, no photo, no line connecting her to Josiah Whitfield's ship." I didn't say anything at that dinner. I want you to understand something about those years. If you haven't lived something like them yourself, the accumulation of small cruelties doesn't feel, in the moment, like something you're allowed to be angry about. Each individual instance is deniable. Each individual instance can be explained away, reframed, softened, until you start to wonder if the problem is your own perception rather than her behavior. That is, I think, exactly how Linda liked it. She never did anything you could point to in a single sentence and say, "There, that was cruel. Call it what it is." She built her cruelty out of 1,000 small omissions, each one small enough to survive scrutiny on its own, and only visible as a pattern if you stepped far enough back to see the whole shape of it. I stepped back one night, about 6 months after the binder incident, lying awake next to Michael, and I counted. I actually made a list on my phone, in the dark, of every incident I could remember. The doc photo, the binder, a birthday party where Linda brought a present for Tyler and forgot Sophie's. Twice, a Christmas card the Whitfields sent out that listed Robert, Linda, Chris, Amanda, Tyler, Michael, and Rachel, and left Sophie's name off the family list entirely. A moment at a barbecue where Linda introduced Sophie to a neighbor as Michael's daughter, in a sentence structure she never once used for Tyler, who was always, unfailingly, our grandson. The list, when I finished it, had 31 entries. 31 moments over 3 years, each one small, each one deniable, each one adding up to something I could no longer pretend I wasn't seeing. I showed the list to Michael the next morning. I watched his face change as he scrolled through it. Not because any single item shocked him, he'd been present for most of them, but because seeing them stacked together, with dates, did something that scattered memory couldn't do. It made the pattern undeniable. "Okay," he said quietly when he finished reading. "Okay, I see it." "Do you?" "I do. I'm sorry. I should have seen it sooner." It was the first real crack in his defense of her, and I remember feeling something loosen in my chest, some tension I'd been carrying for 3 years without fully admitting it was there. I thought, naively, that this was the turning point, that Michael seeing the pattern meant Michael would finally address it, that we would go to his parents' house and have the conversation that needed having, and that Linda, confronted with the evidence, would either change or at least stop pretending she hadn't been doing exactly what she'd been doing. That conversation did happen, eventually. It did not go the way I hoped. For the next 6 weeks, Patricia Whitfield did what women like her do best when they've been caught doing something indefensible. She made herself the victim. It started subtly. She stopped calling to check in on Grace, something she'd done at least twice a week for years, and when Daniel called her instead, she'd answer in a clipped, wounded voice that suggested we were the ones who'd hurt her. She skipped a family dinner at Lauren's house, citing a headache, and I later learned from Lauren that Patricia had spent most of the call beforehand complaining about how ungrateful Daniel had become, how she'd only ever wanted what was best for the family, how it was typical that a daughter-in-law would turn her own son against his mother. That phrase, "turn her own son against his mother," became a kind of refrain that trickled back to us through Lauren, through Gerald, through the extended network of family friends who seemed to hear Patricia's version of events before they ever heard ours. In Patricia's telling, she had made an innocent, well-intentioned mistake, perhaps overstepped a boundary slightly, and Daniel and I had responded by cutting her off from her only grandchild out of spite. It wasn't true. We hadn't cut her off from Grace at all. Daniel had simply told her that we needed some space before the next visit. Some time to figure out how we felt about what she'd done, and what, if anything, needed to change before we could trust her around our daughter again. That's not the same thing as banning her. But in Patricia's mind, and in the version of the story she told anyone who would listen, there was no difference between, "We need some time," and, "You can never see your granddaughter again." Gerald called Daniel privately during this period, which surprised both of us, because Gerald almost never inserted himself into conflicts involving Patricia. He was a peacekeeper by nature, the kind of man who'd spent 40 years married to a strong-willed woman by simply not fighting her on most things. But this time, he called Daniel on a Tuesday evening, his voice heavy with something that sounded almost like guilt, and said, "Your mother told me what happened. I want you to know I had no idea she was doing that. I would never have allowed it, if I'd known." "I believe you, Dad," Daniel told him, "but I need to understand why she did it." She wouldn't give us a real answer. She just kept saying she needed to be sure. Sure of what? Nobody in this family has ever doubted that Grace is my daughter except her. There was a long pause on the line, and Daniel later told me that something in that pause had bothered him for days afterward, not because his father said anything suspicious, but because of what he didn't say. Gerald didn't defend Patricia's reasoning. He didn't offer any theory about why she might have felt the need to test Grace's DNA. He simply said, "Your mother has always been particular about family. I don't know what's going on in her head, son. I wish I did." I didn't think much of that exchange when Daniel first told me about it. I was too consumed with my own anger, too busy trying to figure out how to co-parent a relationship with a woman who had violated something so fundamental about the trust between a mother-in-law and her son's family. It was only weeks later, when everything came apart, that I understood why Gerald's response had felt so strange. Because on some level, Gerald himself had been circling the edges of a question he didn't yet know how to ask. During those 6 weeks, Daniel and I went to see a therapist together. Something we'd never needed before, but both agreed, might help us process what had happened without it fracturing our own marriage. Dr. Yalom, an older woman with kind eyes and an unnervingly perceptive way of asking questions, spent most of our first session simply listening to us describe the DNA test, the confrontation, the weeks of tension that followed. "Can I ask you something?" she said toward the end of that first session, looking at Daniel. "Has your mother ever, in all your years, given any indication that she herself might have something to hide? Sometimes, in my experience, the people most suspicious of others' secrets are protecting one of their own." I remember Daniel laughing, a short, surprised sound. "My mother? She's the most buttoned-up person I know. She irons napkins, Dr. Yalom. She wouldn't know how to keep a secret if her life depended on it." Dr. Yalom just smiled in that careful, knowing way therapists have, and said, "Sometimes the people who seem the most buttoned up are the ones holding the most together underneath. I'm not saying that's the case here. I'm only saying it's worth considering, especially given how disproportionate her reaction seems to be to the situation as you've described it." Neither of us thought much about that comment at the time. We left that session feeling slightly more united, at least, in our shared confusion about Patricia's motives, and we agreed to keep our distance from her for a little while longer, focusing instead on rebuilding a sense of normalcy for Grace, who had started asking, in the innocent and devastating way small children do, why Grandma Pat hadn't come to visit in so long. It wasn't until my mother, of all people, called me on a random Tuesday afternoon in June with a strange question that the whole thing started to unravel in a direction none of us had expected. "Emily," she said, "I don't want to stir up trouble, but I ran into Carol Ferris at the grocery store today, and she said something odd. She asked if everything was all right with Gerald's health, because apparently there's been some talk at the country club about the Whitfields and a paternity issue, and I wanted to check with you before it got back to you in some garbled version." A paternity issue, I repeated slowly. Mom, that was about Grace. Patricia tested Grace's DNA, remember? I told you about this. No, sweetheart, my mother said, and I could hear the hesitation in her voice, the particular carefulness she used when she was about to say something she suspected I wouldn't want to hear. Carol wasn't talking about Grace. She was talking about Daniel. We drove up to Litchfield County on a Saturday in October, Sophie napping in her car seat, Michael quiet beside me the whole way, rehearsing, I think, whatever he'd planned to say. I remember feeling almost sorry for him. He loved his mother. That's a thing people forget when they hear stories like this one, that the person caught between the difficult mother and the wronged wife is not always a coward or a fool. Sometimes he's just someone who has spent his whole life being the buffer between two people he loves, and who has never once been taught how to do that job without losing a piece of himself in the process. Linda made tea, because Linda always made tea when she sensed a confrontation coming. Tea being, in her world, a kind of armor. You cannot be accused of being unkind while pouring Earl Grey into bone china. Robert sat at the far end of the kitchen table, already retreating into his posture, the posture of a man bracing to survive a conversation rather than participate in it. Michael started gently. He always started gently with her. He mentioned the Christmas card, the missing name. He mentioned the binder. He did not mention the doc photo, because Michael, I would learn, had a hierarchy of grievances in his head and only ever brought forward the ones he judged winnable, which meant the ones with the least emotional charge, which meant, in practice, the ones least likely to actually move Linda. The Christmas card was a printing error, Linda said, setting down her cup with a small, precise click. The company we use has a template, and sometimes names get dropped. I called them about it. And the binder? Michael asked. The binder is a work in progress. Genealogy takes time, Michael. You don't just... It's not a birthday card. It requires documentation, verification. I have to be careful about accuracy for the Historical Society. I can't just fill pages with sentiment. Tyler's page has sentiment. It has a note about his nose. Tyler's page was easier to complete because I had the information readily available, Linda said. And here, for the first time, I heard something sharpen underneath the smoothness of her voice, something that had been waiting the whole conversation for an opening. Sophie's information has been harder to pin down. What does that mean? I asked. It was the first thing I'd said since we sat down. Linda looked at me directly for perhaps the first time in the whole visit, and I understood in that look that we had finally arrived at the actual conversation, the one underneath all the other conversations we'd been having for years. It means, Linda said, that I don't have as clear a picture of Sophie's background as I do of Tyler's. That's all. Amanda's family has been very forthcoming. Photos, medical history, her grandmother's maiden name, that sort of thing, for the binder. I simply don't have as much to work with on your side, Rachel. You've never asked me for anything for the binder, I said. Not once. Not a single photo. Not a single question. I didn't want to impose. You interrogated my father about his job history the first night we met. You didn't want to impose about a genealogy binder? Robert made a small sound at the end of the table, not quite a laugh, quickly swallowed. Linda's eyes flicked to him and then back to me, and something in her posture stiffened, a straightening of the spine that I would come to recognize over the following years, as the physical signal that Linda had decided a conversation was now a battle rather than a discussion. I think, she said, that you're reading a great deal into an unfinished project. I'm reading a pattern, I said. 31 incidents over 3 years. I have a list. I hadn't planned to say that. It came out before I'd decided to let it, and I watched Linda's face do something complicated. Surprise, first, quickly masked, and then something colder underneath it. Something that looked, if I'm honest, almost like satisfaction, as though I had finally confirmed a suspicion she'd been carrying about me the whole time. I didn't understand that look until much later. I thought, that afternoon, that it was simply defensiveness. I would come to understand it as something closer to vindication, the look of a woman who believed, on some level, that a wife who kept a list of grievances was a wife who had something to hide, a wife working an angle, rather than a wife who had simply been paying attention. A list, Linda repeated. How thorough of you. Mom, Michael said. No, I think it's worth understanding, Linda said, and she stood up, smoothing her skirt, moving to the counter to refill a kettle that did not need refilling, a habit she had, I noticed over the years, whenever she needed a task to occupy her hands during a conversation she didn't want to be having. I think it's worth understanding that some women come into families like ours and feel, understandably, a certain insecurity. It's a lot to marry into. The history, the expectations. And sometimes that insecurity gets projected outward, onto things that were never intended the way they're received. You left my daughter off the Christmas card, I said. Twice, actually, because you did the same thing the year before, and I let it go because I told myself it was an accident. You gave her one paragraph in a 400-year family history and gave your other grandson 2 full pages with his birth weight and a note about a nose he doesn't even have. That isn't my insecurity, Linda. That's your behavior. I'm just the one writing it down. There was a long silence. I remember the kettle starting to whistle, faint at first and then louder, and Linda not moving to take it off the burner, letting it scream for what felt like 10 full seconds before Robert finally got up and did it himself. I think, Linda said finally very quietly, that I have always tried to treat both grandchildren fairly. I'm sorry if it hasn't felt that way to you. I'll try to do better with the binder. It was, in its way, the closest thing to an apology I ever received from Linda Whitfield, and even as she said it, I understood it wasn't really an apology at all. It was a de-escalation, a tactical retreat, the verbal equivalent of a general pulling troops back to regroup rather than surrender. I would learn over the next 2 years that "I'll try to do better" was Linda's version of a ceasefire, a phrase she deployed whenever a confrontation had gotten close enough to something true that she needed to end it, followed, reliably, by a return to the exact same behavior within a matter of weeks, sometimes days. We drove home, mostly in silence. Sophie woke up somewhere around the state line and started babbling about a dog she'd seen out the window, and I remember watching her in the rearview mirror, this small, oblivious, happy person, completely unaware that she had just been the subject of a conversation about whether she counted, and I felt something harden in me that had not been there before. Not quite hatred. I want to be careful with that word, but something adjacent to it. A cold, settled clarity about who Linda actually was and what I needed to protect Sophie from going forward. She's not going to change, I said to Michael, somewhere around Waterbury. I know, he said. And then, after a pause, I'm sorry. I should have said more in there. You should have, I agreed. But you didn't. And I need you to understand that the next time this happens, and it will happen again, I'm not going to sit quietly through it. I gave Linda 3 years of benefit of the doubt. That's over. He nodded, eyes on the road, and I believed him when he said he understood. I didn't yet know how much worse things were going to get before they got better, or how the woman sitting across that kitchen table, promising to try to do better, was already, at that point, laying the groundwork for something far uglier than a Christmas card. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, not fully understanding what my mother had just said. What do you mean? A paternity issue about Daniel? Daniel is Gerald's son. He's been Gerald's son his entire life. I know, honey. That's what I said to Carol too. But she said the talk going around is that the DNA lab results that got sent to Patricia's house showed something strange. Not about Grace, but about the family line further back. Carol's daughter works in a doctor's office and apparently overheard something. I don't know the details, but she said people are saying there's a question about whether Gerald is really Daniel's biological father. I felt something cold settle in my chest, the particular kind of dread that comes when a piece of information doesn't quite make sense yet, but you can already feel in your body that it's about to change everything. That doesn't make any sense, I said slowly. Patricia tested Grace against herself. That's it. That's what the report said. There was nothing about Daniel and Gerald. But even as I said it, something nagged at me. I thought back to the report itself, the one I'd read 3 times sitting alone at my kitchen table. It had been a grandparentage test, a specific kind of test used to determine whether a child was related to a grandparent when the parent's DNA wasn't available for direct comparison. That kind of test doesn't just compare 2 people directly. It works by analyzing shared genetic markers across generations, essentially triangulating a relationship through inherited patterns. And in my hazy memory of that horrible night, I recalled there being more than 1 page to the report. A second sheet. One I'd barely glanced at because I'd been so consumed by the first page's confirmation. I called Daniel immediately and told him what my mother had said. He went quiet on the phone in a way that scared me. There was a second page, he said slowly. I remember it too. I thought it was just supplementary information, like a technical appendix. I didn't read it carefully because the first page already told us what we needed to know. Do you still have it? It's in my desk drawer. I'll look right now. I heard him set the phone down, heard drawers opening, papers shuffling, and then a long silence that stretched far longer than it should have taken to find a single sheet of paper. When he finally picked the phone back up, his voice sounded different, thinner somehow, like all the air had gone out of it. He said, I need you to come home right now. I left work early, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive, running through a dozen terrible scenarios in my head, none of which came close to what was actually waiting for me on our kitchen table when I walked through the door. Daniel was sitting exactly where I'd found him the night we first discovered the envelope, except this time, instead of 1 sheet of paper, there were 2, spread out side by side. He looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. Not anger, not sadness exactly, but something closer to a person trying to process information that fundamentally didn't fit into the world as he'd understood it. Read the second page, he said, sliding it toward me. I sat down and picked it up. The heading was different from the first page. Instead of grandparent-grandchild relationship analysis, it read Extended Family Comparative Panel, and below that were 2 additional names I hadn't paid attention to before. Reference sample, Gerald T. Whitfield, and comparative sample, Daniel R. Whitfield. My eyes scanned down to the results section, and it took me a moment to understand what I was reading, because the language was clinical, and my brain kept trying to reject the plain meaning of the words. Based on autosomal STR marker comparison, the probability of a biological father-son relationship between Gerald T. Whitfield and Daniel R. Whitfield is calculated at less than 0.1%, indicating exclusion of biological paternity. I looked up at Daniel. This says Gerald isn't your biological father. I know what it says, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've read it about 40 times in the last hour. But how? When did she even get your DNA to compare? And Gerald's? Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. I don't know. I don't know when she did it, or how, but she must have. She must have sent in samples from both of us at some point. probably the same time she tested Grace, because why else would this report even exist? This isn't something you get by accident, Em. She ordered this specific test. She wanted to know for certain whether my dad is really my dad. We sat in silence for a long time after that, both of us staring at a piece of paper that had just quietly detonated everything we thought we understood about the Whitfield family. Because if this was true, and lab reports like this one, run through an accredited facility, don't typically produce false results at this level of statistical certainty, it meant that at some point, decades ago, Patricia Whitfield had done something that shattered the foundation of the very family she'd spent 30 years holding up as an example of propriety and bloodline purity. It meant that all of her suspicion, all of her cold, clinical obsession with whether Grace really belonged in the family, whether my daughter carried enough Whitfield in her features to be trusted, all of it had been projection. Patricia hadn't been protecting the family's bloodline from an outside threat. She'd been running from the fact that she herself had already broken it, decades before Grace was ever born, and some part of her, some deeply buried fear, had needed to know whether the truth about her own past might somehow surface again through her granddaughter. "I need to talk to her," Daniel said finally, his voice hollow. "I need to know who my father actually is." I reached across the table and took his hand, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, my anger at Patricia was joined by something else, something that felt almost like pity, mixed with a deep, unsettling dread about what we were about to find out. "I should tell you about Gerald Haynes, because he matters to everything that comes later, and because if I don't introduce him now, properly, his role in the ending won't land the way it needs to." Gerald had been Robert's best friend since college. They'd roomed together at Trinity, stood up in each other's weddings, gone into business together for a stretch in their 30s before Gerald split off to start his own insurance brokerage in Hartford. He was, by the time I entered the family, a fixture at every Whitfield gathering: Thanksgiving, 4th of July at the Lake House, Founders' Day, the family's biggest annual event, a late August tradition that had apparently started 3 generations back as a modest picnic, and had, by Linda's stewardship, ballooned into a full weekend affair with a guest list, a caterer, and a schedule printed on cardstock. Gerald was, by every account, a wonderful man. Warm, funny, the kind of uncle figure who remembered every kid's name and slipped them $20 bills when their parents weren't looking. Sophie adored him. He called her Duchess, a nickname he'd given her the first time he met her, when she was 2, and had insisted on wearing a paper crown to a birthday party, and the name had stuck, and every time he saw her at a family gathering he'd bow slightly and say, "Ah, Duchess, an honor," and she would shriek with laughter every single time, for years, the joke never getting old to a child for whom repetition is the whole point of comedy. His wife, Diane, had passed away when Michael was in his 20s, and Gerald had never remarried, though he'd had a long relationship in his 50s that ended amicably, and he had one adult son, Danny, from his marriage to Diane, who lived out in Seattle and worked in tech, and came back east maybe twice a year. I'd met Danny exactly once, at a Whitfield Christmas party years before Sophie was born, a tall, quiet man who looked, I remember thinking at the time, almost nothing like Gerald Shaw, Gerald being short and stocky and ruddy-faced, Danny being lean and dark-haired. But families are like that. Sometimes, genetics skip around in ways that don't map neatly onto what you'd expect, and I didn't think about it again for years. Linda's other great preoccupation, alongside the genealogy binder, was an application she'd been working on for over a decade to join the Daughters of the American Revolution, a process that required documenting a direct, unbroken bloodline from herself back to a specific Revolutionary War patriot, with birth certificates, marriage records, wills, land deeds, an exhaustive, expensive, often frustrating paper chase that Linda pursued with a kind of religious devotion. She had already gotten her sister Patricia admitted through their mother's line, but Linda wanted to be admitted through a second, separate Patriot ancestor on their father's side, which would give her what she called double lineage, a distinction that meant a great deal to Linda and, as far as I could tell, absolutely nothing to anyone else on Earth. The DAR application had stalled, repeatedly, on a single generation. Linda's own great-great-grandmother, a woman named Sarah Coombs, whose mailing records had apparently been destroyed in a courthouse fire in the 1890s, leaving a documentary gap that the DAR's genealogists would not accept on the strength of family lore alone. Linda had spent years and, by Robert's occasional grumbling, no small amount of money trying to plug that gap, hiring a professional genealogist, requesting archival records from 3 different states, and finally, in the year before everything happened, turning to consumer DNA testing, which had become, in genealogical circles, an increasingly common tool for supplementing incomplete paper trails. If you could find a DNA match to a documented descendant of the same patriot through a different unbroken line, the DAR would sometimes accept that as corroborating evidence. This is the part of the story that matters, so I want to be very clear about it. Linda's entire justification, later, for what she did to Sophie, was going to be genealogical. She was going to frame it when it finally came out. Not as suspicion about Michael's fidelity or mine, but as a kind of scientific curiosity dressed up in the language of family history. An extension, in her mind, of the exact same project she'd been pursuing for the DAR application. She had, over the previous year, ordered testing kits for herself, for Robert, and, this I did not know until much later, for Gerald Haynes, framing it to him as a favor, a way of cross-checking some old family rumor about a shared ancestor between the Whitfields and the Hayneses several generations back, a rumor that, as far as anyone could tell, Linda had mostly invented on the spot as a pretext. Gerald, being the kind of easy, trusting person who says yes to a friend's wife without thinking too hard about it, spit into a tube, and mailed it off without a second thought. I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, because it's the hinge the entire story turns on. Linda tested herself. She tested her husband. She tested her husband's oldest friend, framing it as genealogical curiosity. And somewhere in that same testing cycle, without telling anyone, without asking anyone, she tested my daughter. Daniel called his mother that same evening and told her, without preamble, that we needed to see her alone, without Gerald, and that it couldn't wait. I could hear, even through the phone pressed to his ear across the kitchen, the change in Patricia's voice when she answered. A brittle, careful tone that told me some part of her already suspected what this visit was about. She asked us to come the following morning, when Gerald has his golf game, which told us everything we needed to know about how deliberately she'd been managing what information reached her husband and when. We dropped Grace at my mother's again, a routine that was becoming painfully familiar, and drove to the Whitfield house in a silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. Patricia met us at the door already dressed as though for battle, in a structured blazer instead of her usual cardigan, her hair set, her composure fully armored. But when Daniel walked past her into the living room and set both pages of the lab report on the coffee table without a word, I watched that composure crack in real time, like watching ice fracture across a pond. "Sit down, Mom," Daniel said quietly. "I want you to explain this to me. All of it. And I want the truth this time, not whatever version of events makes you feel better about what you did." Patricia lowered herself onto the edge of the armchair across from us, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. For a long moment she didn't speak at all. She stared at the 2 sheets of paper on the table as though they might disappear if she looked at them long enough. "How long have you known?" Daniel finally asked. That Dad might not be my biological father. How long, Mom? Patricia's chin trembled, just slightly, before she caught it and forced her face back into something composed. I've known, she said, her voice barely audible. Since before you were born. The room went very still. I felt Daniel's hand tighten around mine on the couch cushion between us. Say that again, he said. I knew, Patricia repeated, louder this time, though the effort of saying it seemed to cost her something physical. That there was a chance, a possibility. I never knew for certain, not until I ordered that test. I told myself for 34 years that it didn't matter, that Gerald was your father in every way that counted, and that the biology of it was irrelevant. I told myself that lie for so long I almost believed it. Who is he? Daniel asked. My biological father. Who is he? Patricia closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears standing in them. The first I'd ever seen from her in 9 years of knowing this woman. His name was Robert Halloway, she said. He was a colleague of your father's, back when Gerald worked at the accounting firm downtown, before he started his own practice. Robert handled some of the same clients. She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again. Your father and I were going through a very difficult period in our marriage that year. Gerald had thrown himself entirely into building the business. We barely spoke for months at a time. I was lonely in a way I didn't have words for back then, and Robert was kind to me, and it was a mistake. A brief one. It lasted perhaps 3 months, and I ended it myself, because I loved your father and I wanted my marriage, whatever its problems, to survive. And you got pregnant, Daniel said, his voice flat. I got pregnant, Patricia confirmed, and I never knew, not for certain, whether it was Gerald's child or Robert's. The timing was close enough that I told myself it was almost certainly your father's, and I chose to believe that, because it was the only version of the truth I could live with. Gerald never knew about the affair. He still doesn't know, not to this day. As far as your father has ever known, you have always simply been his son. I watched Daniel absorb this, watched 34 years of certainty about his own identity rearrange itself in real time on his face. So, all this time, he said slowly, every single comment you ever made about Grace not looking enough like the Whitfields, every time you scrutinized her features like you were building a legal case, that wasn't about Emily. That wasn't about whether Grace was really mine. That was about you. That was you projecting your own fear onto my daughter because you were terrified that if anyone ever looked closely enough at bloodlines in this family, they might eventually look closely enough to find out the truth about you. Patricia didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone hollow, stripped of its usual authority. I suppose that's true, she said. I've spent 34 years terrified that someone would find out. And when Grace was born looking so much like Emily's side of the family, with none of the obvious Whitfield features you'd always had as a child, some old, ugly part of me thought, if resemblance can skip a generation and come out looking like a stranger's family, then maybe mine did too, all those years ago. Maybe it's not so far-fetched after all, that a child could grow up in a family and not truly belong to it by blood, and no one the wiser. So you tested her, I said, my voice shaking now with something that was no longer just anger, but a kind of horrified understanding. You tested my daughter because looking at her reminded you of your own secret. You used her as a stand-in for your own guilt. I didn't think of it that way at the time, Patricia said, though even she seemed to hear how weak that sounded. I told myself I was simply being thorough, making sure everything was as it should be. And when the test on Grace came back clean, Daniel said, when it proved beyond any doubt that she was exactly who we always said she was, why did you go further? Why test me and Dad? What were you actually trying to find out? Patricia's eyes filled again, and this time the tears spilled over, tracking silently down her carefully powdered cheeks. "I think," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "that some part of me needed to finally know." After 34 years of wondering, of lying awake at night doing the math on dates I'd tried for decades to forget, I think ordering that test on Grace gave me the idea that I could finally get an answer to the question I'd been too afraid to ask about myself. So I did it. "I sent in a sample of your hair from an old brush I still had from your childhood, and I got a sample from your father under some pretense. I don't even remember what I told him it was for, and I sent them both in alongside Grace's test, and I told myself I was ready for whatever the answer turned out to be." "And you weren't," Daniel said. "No," Patricia whispered. "I wasn't ready at all." Founders' Day fell on the last weekend of August, and that year, the year Sophie turned 4, we drove up on a Friday afternoon for the full weekend, staying in the guest wing of the main house the way we always did, Chris and Amanda and Tyler arriving Saturday morning, Patricia and her husband coming up from Fairfield, Gerald arriving Friday night with a case of wine and, as always, a small gift for Sophie. That year, a stuffed fox that she named Mr. Foxworthy and slept with for the next 2 years. I want to describe the weekend in some detail, because in hindsight, once I knew what I was looking for, I could see the exact moments where Linda executed her plan, hiding in plain sight inside the ordinary chaos of a big family gathering. At the time, none of it registered as strange. It only became sinister in retrospect, the way a photograph you've looked at 100 times suddenly reveals a face in the background you never noticed before. Saturday afternoon, Linda offered to give Sophie a bath before the evening's big dinner, something she almost never did. Linda was not, by nature, a hands-on grandmother. She was a supervising grandmother, the kind who directed activities rather than participated in them. But that Saturday she insisted, cheerfully, that she wanted some special time with my girl, and I remember feeling a small, unexpected warmth at the phrase, because it was rare enough that I wanted to believe it meant something. I let her take Sophie upstairs. Sophie came down 40 minutes later in a sundress, hair still slightly damp, chattering about a hairbrush Grandma had let her use that had sparkles on it, a detail I filed away as cute and thought nothing more of. It was only months later, sitting with the printed lab report in my hands, that I understood what that sparkly hairbrush had actually been for. A fresh, clean collection point, hair pulled directly from the follicle during a detangling brush-out, exactly the kind of sample a home DNA testing kit's instructions recommend for a young child who can't easily provide a cheek swab without a fight. That same evening, at dinner, I remember Linda clearing dishes with unusual enthusiasm, insisting Robert and I both, "Just relax, sit, I've got this," and gathering up plates and cups with a kind of brisk efficiency that struck me, even at the time, as slightly performative, though I attributed it to Linda simply being in a good mood, wanting the weekend to go well. Michael's water glass, a glass he'd been drinking from all through dinner, his mouth having been on the rim of it a dozen times over 2 hours, went into the stack Linda carried into the kitchen herself, rather than into the dishwasher where everyone else's dishes went. I only remember this detail because Chris made an offhand joke about their mother hand-washing the good crystal, and Linda said something dismissive back, and the moment passed. Unremarkable, forgotten by everyone but me, and only remembered by me because of what came after. There was a third thing too, a thing I actually did notice in the moment, though I didn't understand its significance until much later. Sunday morning, before we left, I walked into the kitchen to find Linda at the counter with a small padded mailing envelope, sealing it with a strip of packing tape, the kind of careful, deliberate sealing you do with something you don't want jostled loose in transit. She startled when she saw me. Actually startled. A small flinch. Quickly covered. And slid the envelope under a stack of mail on the counter. Bills, she said, before I'd asked anything at all. On a Sunday? I said, mostly making conversation, not suspicious yet, just noting the oddity of it. I like to stay ahead of things, Linda said and turned to the sink, and the conversation moved on to whether we'd hit traffic on the way back to New Haven, and I thought nothing more of it for 4 months. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters for understanding how all of this stayed hidden as long as it did. Linda was careful. She was not a woman who left things to chance, and the plan she executed that weekend, the hairbrush, the water glass, the careful sealing of an envelope on a quiet Sunday morning while everyone else was packing the car, required a level of premeditation that still, even now, makes my skin crawl a little when I think about it. She had thought this through. She had waited for an opportunity, the whole family gathered in one house for a weekend, and she had used that opportunity with the same brisk, organized efficiency she used to plan a Founder's Day schedule or a genealogy binder. Whatever else Linda Whitfield was, she was not sloppy. It would take an accident, months later, not my vigilance, not Michael's suspicion, but a genuine, unplanned accident for any of it to come to light. The weekend ended the way it always ended, with a group photo on the porch, everyone squinting into the late August sun, Tyler front and center in Linda's arms, Sophie standing a little apart, holding my hand, her new stuffed fox tucked under one arm, and I remember looking at that photograph weeks later, after everything came out, and noticing, for the first time, the particular expression on Linda's face. Not warmth, not affection, but something closer to satisfaction, the look of a woman who believes she is about to be proven right about something, and who is, for once, willing to wait patiently for the proof to arrive. We left Patricia's house that morning without any clear plan for what came next, only a shared, grim certainty that this could not stay a secret between the three of us. Daniel spent the entire drive home staring out the window, silent in a way that frightened me more than if he'd been crying or shouting. I didn't push him to talk. I just kept one hand on his knee and let him process whatever storm was happening behind his eyes. It was 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening, that Daniel finally said, "I have to tell Dad. I can't let him keep going about his life not knowing something this big about his own family, even if the truth is going to hurt him." I understood the impulse, but I also understood the risk. "Are you sure?" I asked. "Once you tell him, you can't take it back. Gerald's world is going to change too, not just yours." "I know," Daniel said. "But I keep thinking about what you said to my mother, that she used Grace's DNA as a way to satisfy her own guilt without ever having to be honest about it. If I keep this from Dad to protect him, aren't I doing the same thing? Aren't I deciding on his behalf that he doesn't get to know the truth of his own life, because it might be easier for everyone else if he doesn't?" I didn't have a good answer to that because I thought he was right. Gerald deserved to know. Whatever pain the truth caused him, it belonged to him to carry, not to have decided for him by 2 more people protecting him from reality the way Patricia had for 34 years. Daniel asked his father to meet him for lunch that Thursday, just the 2 of them, at a diner they used to go to together when Daniel was a teenager, back before Gerald's accounting practice had grown busy enough to swallow most of his free time. I wasn't there for that conversation. Daniel wanted to have it alone, man to man, without an audience. But he told me everything afterward, sitting on our back porch with a beer he didn't drink, staring out at nothing. Gerald had listened, Daniel said, without interrupting, his face going progressively grayer as Daniel worked through the story. The DNA test on Grace, the second test that neither of them expected, the conversation with Patricia, the affair, the man named Robert Halloway, the 34 years of silence. When Daniel finished, Gerald sat there for a long moment, according to Daniel, just turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer, not drinking it, not looking up. And then he said something that Daniel told me he'd never forget as long as he lived. "I always knew," Gerald said quietly. "Not for certain. Not with any proof. But I knew things weren't right that year, between your mother and me. I knew we'd drifted, that something had happened, even if I never let myself ask what. And when you were born, I looked at you, and I made a decision, right there in that hospital room, that whatever the truth was, I was going to be your father. Not because of blood, because I chose it. Every single day since then, I chose it again." Daniel said he broke down crying at that point, right there in the diner booth, and Gerald reached across the table and gripped his hand, the way he used to when Daniel was small and scared of thunderstorms, and said, "You are my son, Daniel." That was true before this test, and it's true now. A piece of paper from a lab doesn't get to decide that. I decided that 34 years ago, and nothing about today changes it. I cried when Daniel told me that story on the porch. Cried harder than I had through this entire ordeal, because in the middle of so much betrayal and secrecy, Gerald Whitfield's steady, unwavering love for his son felt like the one true, uncomplicated thing in this entire mess. It didn't erase the pain of what Patricia had done, or the years of quiet fear she'd carried alone instead of trusting her husband with the truth. But it gave both of us something to hold on to in the middle of all the wreckage. Proof that fatherhood, real fatherhood, had never actually been about DNA at all, no matter how obsessively Patricia had tried to make it so. Gerald did not leave Patricia, though for a while I thought he might. He told Daniel he needed time, that he was angry, not about the affair itself, which had happened so long ago, and which he said he'd half suspected anyway, but about the 34 years of lies that followed it. The decades of Patricia carrying a secret that fundamentally shaped how she treated her own family without ever giving him the chance to understand why. He moved into the guest room for several weeks. He stopped attending the country club events Patricia loved. He started seeing a therapist of his own, something Daniel said he'd never imagined his stoic, quiet father doing in 100 years. But he didn't leave. When Daniel asked him why, months later, Gerald said simply, "I built 34 years with that woman. I raised a son with her. A good one. A son I'm proud of every single day. I'm not going to let one conversation erase 34 years, even if it changes how I understand some of them. But she and I have a lot of rebuilding to do, and some of it, frankly, is her work to do, not mine." News like this doesn't stay contained, no matter how hard people try to keep it quiet, and within a month, the story had made its way through the rest of the Whitfield family in the particular, garbled way that family secrets always do. Half true, half exaggerated, picked up and repeated by people who'd only heard fragments. Lauren, Daniel's younger sister, found out from Gerald directly, and she called me the same night, her voice a mixture of shock and something that sounded almost like vindication. "I always felt like there was something off about how Mom treated the two of us differently," she said. She was always harder on Daniel, in this weird, particular way, like she was watching him more closely than she watched me. I used to think it was because he was the oldest, or because he was the boy. But now I wonder if some part of her was always watching him for signs, you know? Looking for proof, one way or the other, about whose son he really was. I hadn't considered that angle before, but once Lauren said it, I couldn't stop turning it over in my mind. All the ways Patricia's fear might have shaped not just her treatment of me and Grace, but her entire relationship with Daniel across his whole life. I thought about the story Patricia had told once, at a holiday dinner. Not delight, but reconnaissance. A woman looking for evidence to quiet a fear she could never voice out loud. Lauren was angry with Patricia in a way I hadn't expected, angrier in some ways than Daniel himself. She let this shape how she treated Emily for years, Lauren said to me on the phone. She let this secret turn into a decade of suspicion aimed at someone who did nothing wrong. That's not a small thing, Emily. That's not something you just get over because she finally explained herself. Patricia's own sister, Aunt Diane, took a different position entirely when the story eventually reached her. She defended Patricia fiercely, insisting that everyone makes mistakes when they're young, that the affair itself, decades old, wasn't anyone's business, and that Daniel and I were being cruel by punishing Patricia now for something that happened before either of us were even part of the family. This caused its own rift, a smaller one, between Diane and the rest of us, and for a while, family gatherings became a minefield of who was speaking to whom and who had taken which side. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters. I didn't actually care very much about the affair itself. Whatever happened between Patricia and Gerald in their marriage, decades before I ever entered the picture, wasn't my business, and in some strange way, I could even understand it. Loneliness does things to people, and I've never believed that one mistake, made in a moment of genuine unhappiness, has to define a person forever. If Patricia had simply told the truth early on and let Gerald decide what to do with that information back when Daniel was born, this entire story would look very different, and I don't think I would have judged her nearly as harshly as I did. What I couldn't forgive, what I still, if I'm honest, struggle to fully forgive, was what she did with that secret afterward. 34 years of silence is one thing. Using her own granddaughter's hair, taken without permission while brushing it before a nap, as an instrument to quiet her own guilt, is another thing entirely. Patricia had a secret, and instead of ever confronting it honestly, she spent decades projecting her fear outward, first as generalized suspicion toward me, and eventually as literal, physical intrusion into my daughter's body, in the form of hair and tissue samples collected in secret and shipped off to a lab. That's the part I couldn't get past. Not the affair, the cowardice that came after it, and the way that cowardice had quietly poisoned years of my relationship with my own mother-in-law, without me ever understanding why. Grace, thankfully, was too young to understand any of the adult complexity swirling around her that summer. She noticed that Grandma Pat wasn't visiting as often, and she asked about it sometimes, in the direct, unfiltered way 5-year-olds ask difficult questions. But we told her simply that grown-ups sometimes needed time to work through disagreements, and that it had nothing to do with her. I made a point of never letting Grace feel, even for a second, that any part of this mess was about whether she really belonged in this family. She belonged. She had always belonged. The only person who had ever questioned that was the one person who should have known better than anyone how much more complicated the truth of belonging actually was. Daniel struggled more visibly than I expected, in the weeks that followed his conversation with Gerald. He'd go quiet sometimes at dinner, staring at his plate, and I'd ask what he was thinking, and he'd say something like, "I keep looking in the mirror trying to figure out which parts of my face are actually his," meaning Gerald, and which parts might belong to a man I've never met and never will. He started researching Robert Holloway online, late at night when he thought I was asleep, and one evening, about 2 months after everything came out, he finally told me what he'd found. 4 months passed, uneventfully, or what passed for uneventfully in a family like ours, which is to say the usual quota of small slights continued. A birthday card for Tyler with a check tucked inside. No equivalent card for Sophie that year. Dismissed by Linda over the phone as an oversight. I'll mail something this week. A mailing that never came. I had by then mostly stopped keeping score in my head. Not because I'd given up exactly, but because Michael and I had settled into a kind of workable equilibrium. We saw his parents less, I kept my expectations low, and I focused my energy on the parts of our life that had nothing to do with Litchfield County, which was most of it. Sophie was thriving at preschool. Michael had made partner at his firm that spring. We were, in the parts of our life that were actually ours, happy. It was Michael who found the first thread in January, on an ordinary Tuesday night, sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop while I gave Sophie a bath. He came into the bathroom holding his phone, his face doing something I'd never quite seen it do before. A kind of frozen, uncomprehending stillness, like he'd read a sentence in a foreign language he was only half sure he'd translated correctly. "Someone messaged me," he said, "on LinkedIn, a guy named Danny Haynes." I remember not immediately connecting the name, my hands still full of a wet, squirming 4-year-old. "Gerald's son. What did he want?" Michael read the message aloud, and I want to reproduce it as close to exactly as I remember it, because I've thought about the exact wording so many times since. It said something like, "Hey Michael, this is a little out of the blue and I apologize if it's weird, but I got a notification from a DNA site my dad had me do a kit for a while back. It's flagging you as a close family match, likely paternal half-sibling. I know that sounds insane. I almost didn't message you, but I figured I'd rather ask than wonder. Any chance you know anything about this? Totally fine if not. Just curious." I sat there on the edge of the bathtub, Sophie splashing water onto my jeans, completely unbothered by the fact that the adults in the room had both gone very quiet, and I felt the specific, lurching kind of confusion that comes when a piece of information doesn't fit anywhere in the story you already believe about your life. "That doesn't make sense," Michael said. "I've never done a DNA test. I don't have an account on any of these sites." "Do you think it's a scam? People fake these messages sometimes." "Maybe," he said, but he didn't sound convinced, and neither did I. Not really, because there was something too specific about it, too oddly worded to be a generic scam. A scam message doesn't usually name a real family friend's actual adult son and frame the ask with that kind of careful, apologetic hedging. We put Sophie to bed together that night, both of us distracted, both of us going through the motions of the bedtime routine while our minds turned over the same impossible sentence. Once she was asleep, Michael sat back down at the kitchen table and did what I would have done in his position, what anyone would have done. He searched his own name on the testing service Danny had mentioned, a company I'll call BioRoots here, one of the larger consumer genealogy platforms, the kind that advertises during football games and sends people little cardboard boxes with spit tubes inside. He didn't have an account, of course. He'd never made one. But the search function on their public Verify a Match page allowed you to check, using an email address, whether that email was associated with any kit in their system, a feature meant to help people track down long-lost kits they'd forgotten about. He typed in his own email. Nothing. He typed in mine. Nothing. And then, almost as an afterthought, sitting there at 11 at night with his jaw tight in a way I'd rarely seen, he typed in his mother's email address. 4 kits came back, linked under a single family management account: Linda Whitfield, Robert Whitfield, Gerald Haynes. And a 4th, listed not under a name but under an initial and a birth year: SWDOB 2020, the initials and birth year that matched, unmistakably, our daughter. "She tested Sophie," Michael said, and his voice had gone very flat, the particular flatness of a person working very hard not to feel something yet, because feeling it might mean breaking something. "She tested my daughter without telling us, and she tested herself, and my dad, and Gerald." "Why would she test Gerald?" "I don't know," Michael said. "I don't know any of this. I don't understand any of this." I want to pause here and tell you what it feels like, in the moment, to learn that someone has taken a piece of your child, a strand of her hair, collected under the pretense of a bath, and a sparkly hairbrush, and sent it to a laboratory to be analyzed, without your knowledge, without your consent, in service of some private theory she'd never once said out loud to your face. It feels like a violation in a category I didn't have language for beforehand. It wasn't like being insulted, which I'd grown almost numb to over the years. It was something closer to being robbed, the specific nauseating sensation of realizing someone had been inside a space you believed was protected, taking something that belonged to your child, using it for a purpose you hadn't agreed to and would never have agreed to, and doing it quietly enough that you'd had no chance to stop it. "We need to call her," I said. "Not tonight," Michael said. I need to think about how I want to do this. She's going to lie. She's going to minimize it. I want to know exactly what I'm dealing with before I give her the chance to spin it." He was right to be cautious, though neither of us understood that night just how much bigger the thing we were dealing with actually was. "He died 11 years ago," Daniel told me that night, sitting on the edge of our bed with his laptop open, an old obituary pulled up on the screen. "Heart attack. He was 72. He lived in Columbus most of his life, worked as an accountant until he retired, had 2 kids from his own marriage, a son and a daughter, both older than me. The obituary mentions grandchildren. I might have half-siblings, cousins for grace, if you count it that way. People I've never met and never will meet, who share half my DNA and don't know I exist." I sat down next to him and looked at the photo attached to the obituary. An older man with silver hair, a strong jaw, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I searched his face for some trace of Daniel and found, unsettlingly, that I could see it. Something in the set of the eyes, maybe, or the shape of the ears, subtle enough that I might have imagined it, but they're all the same. "Do you want to reach out to his family?" I asked carefully. "The son and daughter, I mean. If they're still alive?" Daniel was quiet for a long time before he answered. "I don't know," he finally said. "Part of me wants to know if I look like him, if I have his mannerisms, if any part of who I am makes more sense once I understand where half my genetics actually came from. But another part of me thinks, what would that even accomplish? Gerald raised me. Gerald taught me how to drive, how to shave, how to throw a baseball, how to be a decent husband and father. Robert Halloway is a stranger who happened to share a biological connection with me because of something that happened between 2 unhappy people 34 years ago. I don't owe him anything, and honestly, I don't know that finding his other kids would give me anything except more complicated feelings to sort through. I didn't push him either way. This was Daniel's decision to make, in his own time, and I understood, watching him wrestle with it over the following weeks, that there wasn't a clean, correct answer here. Some people in his position would have desperately wanted to meet their biological half-siblings, to fill in the missing pieces of a family tree that had suddenly split in 2 directions. Others would have wanted nothing to do with it, preferring to let the past stay buried where it had been for 34 years. Daniel landed somewhere in between. He ended up writing a single email to the address listed for Robert Halloway's daughter on a family memorial website, explaining, gently and carefully, who he was and what he'd recently learned. He told me he didn't expect a response, and for 2 months, he didn't get one. When the reply finally came, it was brief, but warm. A woman named Christine, surprised but not unkind, who said she'd suspected, based on some old letters she'd found after her father's death, that he might have had a life outside their family that no one ever talked about. She said she wasn't ready to meet in person, not yet, but that she appreciated Daniel reaching out honestly instead of hiding the connection, and that maybe, someday, when the shock wore off a little more for both of them, they could have coffee and see where things stood. Daniel told me that email gave him a strange kind of peace, even without a dramatic reunion attached to it. I don't need Christine to be my sister in any real sense, he said. I just needed to know that the truth existed somewhere outside my own head, that I wasn't the only person carrying it. That's enough for now. Meanwhile, my own relationship with Patricia entered a strange, uncertain period that neither of us knew how to navigate. She reached out a handful of times that summer, tentative, uncharacteristically humble emails asking how Grace was doing, whether we might consider a short visit, whether there was anything she could do to begin repairing what she'd broken. I didn't respond to most of them right away. I needed time. More time than I think Patricia expected, to sort through my own feelings about a woman who had spent 9 years treating me with suspicion because of a secret that had nothing to do with me at all. It was Gerald, in the end, who helped bridge that gap, in his own quiet way. He called me one afternoon in late July, and after some small talk about Grace's upcoming kindergarten enrollment, he said something that stuck with me. I know what my wife did to your daughter was wrong, Emily. I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise, and I'm not asking you to forgive her on any particular timeline. But I've known Patricia for 36 years, and I can tell you that the woman who did that thing wasn't the whole of who she is. She spent her entire adult life terrified of being found out as someone who made a mistake once, a long time ago, and that fear turned her into someone harder and colder than she might have been otherwise. That doesn't excuse it. But I wanted you to know that Gerald Whitfield still believes there's a decent woman under all that fear, even now. I'm choosing to stay and find out. You don't have to make the same choice, but I wanted you to have all the information before you decide. I appreciated Gerald's honesty more than I could say. It didn't change my feelings overnight, but it gave me something to think about. A reminder that people are rarely just one thing, that even the coldest, most difficult mother-in-law I'd ever known was also a frightened young woman once, 34 years ago, who made a mistake, and then spent the rest of her life running from the consequences of it in increasingly destructive ways. It took until October, 6 months after I first found that envelope on my kitchen counter, before Patricia and I sat down together, just the two of us, for the conversation that finally started to shift things between us. She asked to meet me at a coffee shop, neutral ground, rather than either of our homes, and I remember being surprised by how nervous she seemed when she arrived, 10 minutes early, already seated at a corner table with 2 cups of tea ordered before I even walked in. Gone was the polished armor I was used to. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like an ordinary woman in her 60s, tired and a little unsure of herself. I've been seeing a therapist, she said, before I'd even sat down fully. Since August. Gerald suggested it, and I resisted for a long time, because I've never been the sort of person who believed in that kind of thing. But I've been going, twice a week, and I wanted you to know that, because I think it matters for what I'm about to say. I sat down across from her and waited. I'd learned, over the past several months, not to fill silences with reassurance the way I used to. I let her sit in the discomfort of it. I owe you an apology, Patricia finally said, and I've written out, more than once, what I wanted to say, because I was afraid if I didn't plan it, I'd fall back into old habits and make excuses instead. So I'm going to say this as plainly as I can, and I'd like you to let me finish before you respond, if that's all right. I nodded. I spent 34 years terrified that someone would discover a mistake I made when I was 28 years old, unhappy in my marriage in a way I never had the courage to address honestly with my husband. Instead of dealing with that fear directly, instead of ever telling Gerald the truth and letting him make his own choices about what to do with it, I buried it. And over the years, that buried fear turned into something ugly. It turned into suspicion I aimed at people who had done nothing to deserve it. It turned into me treating you, from the very first night I met you, as a threat to be managed, rather than a person to be welcomed into my family. None of that had anything to do with who you actually were, Emily. It had everything to do with the fact that I was terrified of what it might mean about me if resemblance and bloodlines ever became a subject anyone examined too closely. She paused, took a breath, continued. And then Grace was born, looking so much like your side of the family, and instead of simply loving my granddaughter the way I should have, the way she deserved, from her very first day, I let my own old fear turn into cruelty aimed at a baby. I cataloged her features like evidence in a trial. I made comments to you for years that I told myself were harmless observations, when really they were an old woman's guilt looking for somewhere else to live. And then, when that guilt became unbearable, I did something unforgivable. I took my own granddaughter's hair without asking you, without asking Daniel, and I used her body to try to quiet a fear that had nothing to do with her at all. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for that. Not sorry that you're upset, which is what I said back in the spring, and which I now understand was its own kind of cowardice. I am sorry for what I actually did. It was wrong, and it caused you real harm, and I have no excuse for it that makes it acceptable. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time in months. Not full forgiveness, not yet, but something like the beginning of a door opening that I'd assumed was permanently shut. Thank you for saying that, I told her. I need you to understand that I'm not going to pretend the last 9 years didn't happen, or that the DNA test didn't happen, just because you've apologized. Trust takes time to rebuild, and I think it should take time, given what was broken. But I appreciate that you're finally being honest, both with yourself and with me. I don't expect instant forgiveness, Patricia said. I don't think I deserve it, honestly. But I would like the chance to be a real grandmother to Grace, going forward, not the version of myself who spent years measuring her against some invisible standard, but someone who simply loves her for who she is. And I would like the chance to be a mother-in-law to you who treats you the way you should have been treated from the very beginning. I know that's going to take time. I'm willing to put in the work, if you'll let me. We didn't resolve everything that afternoon. Some wounds don't close in a single conversation, no matter how honest it is. But it was a start, and over the following year, Patricia did put in the work she'd promised, showing up consistently, softening in ways that felt genuine rather than performative, learning, slowly, how to be curious about Grace instead of suspicious of her. She started asking Grace questions about her interests instead of scrutinizing her features. She stopped making comments about resemblance entirely, not because she was biting her tongue, I came to believe, but because the compulsion itself had finally started to fade, now that the secret underneath it was finally out in the open. Michael didn't sleep much that week. I watched him turn into someone I barely recognized. Not angry, exactly. Or not only angry, but occupied in the specific way people get occupied when they're trying to solve a puzzle they're afraid of the answer to. He spent 2 nights on the phone with BioRoots customer service, working his way up through tiers of representatives who were, understandably, constrained by privacy policies from telling the husband of an account holder's daughter-in-law much of anything, until he finally got someone willing to explain, in general terms, what a close family match, probable half-sibling designation actually meant on their platform. It means shared DNA in the range you'd expect between 2 people with one shared parent, the representative told him, reading, Michael said, from some kind of script. It's usually accurate to a very high degree of confidence once the algorithm flags it that strongly. It could indicate half-siblings, or in rarer cases, an uncle-nephew or grandparent-grandchild relationship, but the specific percentage range in cases like the one you're describing usually points to half-siblings. And this would show up between 2 people who don't share a mother, Michael said. It wasn't quite a question. It can indicate a shared father, yes, or a shared mother. The test itself doesn't specify which, but combined with other information, surnames, known family history, people are often able to work it out. I was in the room for that call, sitting across the table, watching Michael's face as he absorbed each sentence, and I remember thinking, even before he said anything, that I already understood where this was going, the way you sometimes understand the ending of a story, a page before the author actually tells you. Gerald isn't my mother's brother, Michael said slowly, after he hung up the phone. He's not related to her at all. If this match is real, if I'm actually a close match to Danny Haynes, a half-sibling match, then the only father Danny and I could share is Gerald. Michael. My dad isn't my father, he said, and his voice cracked on the word father in a way I had never heard it crack before, not once in 11 years of marriage. And I got up and went around the table and put my arms around him, and he let me, which was its own kind of answer, because Michael was not a man who easily let himself be held when he was falling apart. He usually tried to hold himself together alone first, out of some old, inherited Whitfield instinct that emotion was a private matter, something to be managed rather than shared. That night, he didn't try to manage it. He just shook, quietly, for a long time, while Sophie slept upstairs, unaware that the entire architecture of her father's family was quietly rearranging itself around her. "We don't know anything for certain," I said, once he'd calmed down enough to hear it. "A LinkedIn message and a public lookup tool aren't proof of anything. We need to actually know, one way or another, before either of us loses our minds over a maybe." He agreed, and 2 days later, without telling anyone, he ordered his own kit from BioRoots. A real one, in his own name, with his own email, paying for expedited processing, which the company charged an extra $90 for, and which felt, at the time, like the smallest possible price for an answer we both needed and dreaded in equal measure. The 2.5 weeks it took for the results to process were, I think, the longest 2.5 weeks of our marriage up to that point. Michael went to work every day and came home every night and functioned, more or less, as a husband and a father, reading Sophie her bedtime stories, laughing at her jokes. But there was a thinness to him during those weeks, a person operating on the surface of himself while something enormous churned underneath, waiting. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon while Sophie was at preschool. Michael called me at work. I was between patients at the clinic where I did occupational therapy with kids on the spectrum, a job I loved and was good at, and which had, over the years, taught me an enormous amount about patients that I did not know. At that point, I was about to need in an entirely different context. "It's done processing," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I haven't opened it yet. I wanted to open it with you." I left work early, told my supervisor a half-truth about a family emergency, which wasn't really a half-truth at all, and drove home faster than I should have. Michael was sitting at the kitchen table when I got there, laptop closed in front of him, hands folded on top of it like he was praying, or maybe like he was trying to physically hold the computer shut a little longer to delay the moment by a few more seconds. "Okay," he said, when I sat down across from him. "Okay." He opened the laptop. He clicked through to the results. And there it was, in the clean, clinical formatting of a genealogy website's interface, a section titled Your DNA Matches, sorted by relationship strength, and at the very top of the list, above second cousins and third cousins and a scattering of distant names neither of us recognized, was a single entry: Danny Haynes. Relationship, close family, predicted, half-sibling. Shared, N.A., 1,743 centimorgans. Michael stared at the number for a long time before he said anything. "That's it," he said finally. "That's a real number. That's not a maybe. That's a half-sibling." I didn't know, at that point, exactly what a centimorgan was or how the math worked, but I understood the shape of what Michael was telling me, and I understood, watching his face, that some foundational piece of who he'd believed himself to be for 39 years had just quietly, irreversibly shifted underneath him. Robert Whitfield, the man who had walked him down to his first day of kindergarten, who had taught him to sail on the lake, who had cried at our wedding and called me sweetheart and meant it, was, in the strict biological sense that this website measured in centimorgans, not his father. Gerald Haynes was. "We need to talk to your mother," I said. "Before anyone else knows. Before this comes out some other way." "I know," Michael said. "But I think, Rachel, I think she already knows. I think this is exactly what she was looking for when she tested Sophie. I think she's known this could be true for a long time, and I think that's why she tested everyone, not just Sophie. I think she was trying to check whether it would come out and figure out how to control it if it did." I remember sitting with that thought, turning it over, and feeling something cold settle into my stomach, because if Michael was right, and I would come to believe, in the weeks that followed, that he was entirely right, then everything Linda had ever said about Sophie's coloring, every comment about who did and didn't look like a Whitfield, every year of scrutinizing my daughter's face for evidence that she didn't belong, had been coming from a woman who had spent 39 years hiding a secret about her own son's paternity, using her obsession with bloodline and legitimacy as a shield against anyone ever looking too closely at her own past. The irony of it was almost too large to hold in my head all at once. Linda had spent 5 years questioning whether my daughter was real Whitfield material. And the whole time, the deepest, oldest secret buried in that family's carefully documented 400-year lineage was her own. Grace's 6th birthday party fell almost exactly 1 year after the party we'd been preparing for, when I first found that envelope on the kitchen counter. The mermaid cake, the pastel streamers, the ordinary Thursday that turned into the beginning of everything unraveling. I hadn't planned it that way. Birthdays just land where they land. But I remember standing in my kitchen the morning of that party, hanging streamers again, feeling a strange, dizzying sense of how much had changed in the span of exactly 12 months. Patricia arrived early to help, the same way she had the year before. Except this time there was no tension underneath the pleasant surface, no secret being carried into my house disguised as generosity. She'd brought a present for Grace, a set of art supplies, carefully chosen based on an actual conversation she'd had with Grace 2 weeks earlier about wanting to learn to paint. And she spent an hour before the party helping me blow up balloons, laughing at herself when half of them kept slipping out of her hands before she could tie them off. "I used to be better at this," she said, chasing down a runaway blue balloon across the living room. "Apparently, being a grandmother who actually shows up requires more physical coordination than I remembered." I laughed, genuinely, and it struck me in that moment how different this felt from a year earlier. Not because the past had been erased, but because we'd built something new on top of it, brick by careful brick, over 12 months of small gestures and honest conversations and Patricia's continued therapy, which she still attended twice a week and occasionally referenced with a kind of wry self-awareness that would have been unimaginable from the woman I met 9 years earlier. Gerald and Patricia were still married, still working through their own version of rebuilding trust, though Gerald had moved back into their bedroom sometime in the spring, a fact Daniel mentioned to me with visible relief. Their marriage, from what I could observe as an outsider looking in, had become something quieter and more honest than it had been before. Less about performing a perfect image for the world, more about two people who had been through something painful together and decided deliberately to keep choosing each other anyway. Daniel's relationship with his father had, if anything, deepened over the year. They'd started having a standing lunch date every other Thursday, something that had never existed before the DNA results came out, as though the crisis had somehow given them permission to be more openly affectionate with each other than the stoic Whitfield family culture had traditionally allowed. Daniel told me once, driving home from one of those lunches, that he'd stopped thinking about Robert Halloway almost entirely. "Gerald is my father," he said. "He always was. The only thing that changed is that now I understand exactly how much he chose that, every single day, instead of just assuming it. And somehow, that makes it mean more, not less." Christine, Robert Halloway's daughter, had reached out again in the spring, and she and Daniel had met for coffee in Columbus. A strange, careful meeting that Daniel described afterward as meeting a stranger who happens to have the same nose as me. They didn't become close, not in any dramatic, movie-worthy way, but they exchanged occasional emails, and Christine sent Grace a small gift the following Christmas, a gesture that felt less like the beginning of a deep relationship and more like two people acknowledging a strange, quiet thread connecting their lives without needing to make more of it than it was. As for me, my relationship with Patricia has become something I genuinely could not have predicted a year earlier, sitting at my kitchen table with a shaking DNA report in my hands. It isn't perfect. There are still moments when an old comment slips out of her, a remark about someone's coloring or features that makes something in my chest tighten reflexively. A muscle memory of 9 years of careful defensiveness that doesn't disappear overnight just because the underlying fear has been named and addressed. But those moments are rare now, and when they happen, Patricia catches herself almost immediately, in a way she never used to, and says something like, "I'm sorry, old habit, ignore me," which is its own small, ongoing act of accountability that I've come to appreciate more than I expected to. Grace, now 6, calls her Grandma Pat, in exactly the same warm, easy voice she uses for my own mother, and watching that shift happen over the course of a year, watching Patricia earn, through consistent effort, the kind of uncomplicated affection she'd spent years unconsciously sabotaging with her own fear, has been one of the most unexpectedly moving parts of this entire story. At the party, near the end of the afternoon, after the cake had been cut and the presents opened and most of the guests had gone home, I found Patricia sitting on the back porch steps with Grace, the two of them looking at a picture book together, Patricia's reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she read in a soft, patient voice I'd never heard her use before any of this happened. Grace was leaning into her side the way children lean into people they feel safe with, completely unguarded, completely trusting. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, just watching them, and felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as a strange, hard-won kind of peace. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story now, why I didn't just cut Patricia out of our lives entirely after what she did. It's a fair question, and for a while, in the rawest weeks right after I found that envelope, I genuinely considered it. There's a version of this story where Daniel and I decide that some betrayals are simply too large to come back from, where we build a wall around our small family and never let Patricia close enough to hurt us again. I don't think that version would have been wrong, exactly. Some families do need those walls, and I don't judge anyone who's had to build one against a mother-in-law, a father, a sibling, whoever it is that's made trust feel too dangerous to extend again. But the more I sat with what happened, the more I understood the actual shape of Patricia's fear, rather than just the damage it caused, the more I came to believe that there was a difference between what she did and who she fundamentally was capable of becoming. That's a distinction I think is worth making, even though it took me a long time to make it honestly, rather than simply as a way of excusing bad behavior. Patricia's actions were genuinely harmful. The years of suspicion, the secret testing of my daughter's DNA, The cold, clinical scrutiny she aimed at a child too young to understand why her grandmother looked at her the way she did. None of that gets erased by an apology, however sincere. But I came to believe that people who cause harm out of untreated fear, rather than out of genuine malice, sometimes have real capacity to change, if they're willing to actually look at the fear instead of continuing to run from it. The turning point for me, if I'm honest, wasn't even the apology at the coffee shop, as meaningful as that conversation was. It was watching Patricia actually do the harder, less visible work in the months that followed. The twice-weekly therapy she kept attending long after the crisis had technically passed. The small moments of self-correction I started noticing, the way she began asking Grace open, curious questions instead of making clinical observations about her features. Words are easy. Anyone can say "I'm sorry" in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. What convinced me that something had actually shifted was watching a 62-year-old woman, set in decades of defensive habits, do the slow, unglamorous work of actually becoming someone different, one small choice at a time. I also learned something harder about myself during this whole ordeal, which is that I had spent years absorbing Patricia's coldness as though it were simply a fact of nature. Something to be managed rather than something to be named and confronted directly. My mother's advice, kill her with kindness, had served me well in some ways, but it had also, I came to realize, allowed years of genuinely hurtful behavior to go unaddressed because I'd trained myself to treat it as background noise rather than as something worth standing up against. If I could go back and tell my younger self one thing, standing in that dining room 9 years ago while Patricia dissected my college and my mother's job in front of the whole family, I think I would tell her, "You're allowed to say something. You're allowed to name unkindness when you see it, even when it's wrapped in pearls and good posture and dinner party manners." Kindness and boundaries are not opposites. I wish I'd understood that sooner. There's also something I've thought about a great deal since all of this happened, which is how much damage can come from a single untold truth, left to fester for decades instead of being spoken honestly at the time it happened. If Patricia had told Gerald the truth 34 years ago, if she'd had the courage, in that moment, to say, "I made a mistake, and I don't know for certain whose child I'm carrying, and I need you to help me figure out what we do with that." An enormous amount of pain, spread out over 3 decades and inflicted on people who weren't even born yet, might never have happened at all. Secrets don't stay still. They grow roots. They reach forward into lives that have nothing to do with the original mistake, and they find new and increasingly destructive ways to surface, usually at the worst possible moment. Usually causing far more damage in their eventual unraveling than an honest, difficult conversation would have caused at the time. I don't say this to excuse Patricia. I say it because I think it's a lesson worth carrying forward for anyone reading this who's holding on to a secret they've convinced themselves is smaller, or safer, or more manageable than it actually is. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, one way or another. It's almost always less costly to tell it yourself, on your own terms, than to have it dragged into the light decades later by circumstances entirely outside your control. We didn't get the chance to choose when the confrontation happened. Linda chose it for us, the way she chose almost everything in that family, and she chose it in the worst possible way. A big, formal, catered dinner, the Sunday after Easter, at the main house, with everyone invited. Chris and Amanda and Tyler, Patricia and her husband Gerald, and, as Linda phrased it in the group text she sent out 3 weeks in advance, a small announcement I'm excited to share about our family history. She'd hired a caterer. She'd ordered flowers. She had, by every appearance, been planning this evening for months, with the same meticulous energy she brought to Founders Day and the genealogy binder and the DAR application. And I understood, the moment I read that text, exactly what kind of announcement she meant to make, and exactly whose legitimacy she intended to put on trial in front of the entire extended family. Michael wanted to confront her privately first, to head it off before it became a spectacle. I was the one who talked him out of it, and I want to be honest about my reasoning, because it wasn't purely strategic. Some part of me, after 5 years of small, deniable cruelties that I was never allowed to call by their real name, wanted Linda to walk into that dinner believing she held all the cards, and I wanted her to be standing in front of the entire family, in the house with the genealogy chart in the front hallway, when she found out she didn't. If we confront her privately, she controls the story, I said. She apologizes to us alone, in her kitchen, and by the time everyone else hears about it, it's been through her filter 3 times. If it comes out at the dinner she planned, in front of everyone, she doesn't get to control anything. Michael was quiet for a long moment. That feels cruel, he said finally, even for her. She tested our daughter's hair without asking, I said. She tested your DNA off a water glass without asking. She invited the entire family to a dinner to discuss whether Sophie's genetics meet her standards. I think we can survive being a little bit cruel back this once. He agreed in the end, though I don't think he was ever entirely comfortable with the plan, and I understood that discomfort too. It is one thing to want justice for your child, and another thing entirely to want it delivered to your own mother in front of an audience, however much she'd earned it. The dinner was on a Sunday in late April, the dogwoods blooming along the driveway, the dining room set with the good china, place cards at every seat in Linda's careful cursive. Gerald arrived first, as he almost always did, with a case of wine and a joke for everyone, calling out, "Duchess," to Sophie the moment he saw her, sweeping her into a hug that she returned with her whole small body, utterly unaware, the way children are blessedly unaware, that the man hugging her was about to become the center of a revelation that would upend everything she thought she understood about her family. I remember looking at Gerald that evening with a strange, doubled vision, the same warm, familiar uncle figure I'd known for 11 years, and, underneath that, a man who did not yet know he was, in all likelihood, a father twice over instead of once. A man about to learn that a friendship spanning 40 years had a hidden dimension he'd never suspected. Dinner proceeded normally for the first hour. Linda in excellent spirits, animated, refilling wine glasses, asking Amanda about Tyler's soccer season with the kind of focused, delighted attention she never once turned toward Sophie's preschool updates. I watched her carefully that night, the way you watch a storm system on a radar map, and I could see, underneath the hostess performance, a current of anticipation, a woman counting down to a moment she'd been rehearsing in her head for weeks. She waited until dessert. Of course she waited until dessert. Linda understood theater, understood pacing, understood that an announcement lands hardest when the audience is relaxed, full, unguarded. She stood up at the head of the table, tapped her wine glass with a spoon, an actual, literal tap of a spoon against crystal, and the table went quiet the way tables do when someone signals a speech is coming. "I wanted to gather everyone together tonight," she began, "because I've been working on something for the Historical Society, and along the way, it's led me into some research about our own family that I think is important for all of us to understand. I know some of you know I've been pursuing DAR membership for years, and that project has taught me a great deal about how much we don't know about our own history, even the history sitting right in our own house." She reached beside her chair and produced a manila folder, thick with printed pages, and my stomach dropped, because I recognized, even from across the table, the particular blue and white logo of BioRoots on the cover sheet. "Over the past year, I did some DNA testing," Linda continued, "partly for the DAR application and partly, I'll admit, out of simple curiosity about all of us. Robert and I did kits. Gerald was kind enough to help me look into an old family rumor about a shared ancestor between the Whitfields and the Hayneses, generations back. She paused here, and her eyes moved, deliberately, to me, and then to Sophie, who was sitting in her booster seat between Michael and me, entirely absorbed in a piece of chocolate cake. And I also did a kit for Sophie? The table went very still. Amanda's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Chris looked at his mother and then at me, confusion plain on his face. Patricia frowned. Robert, at the far end of the table, went the particular shade of pale that I would recognize, later, as the color of a man realizing his wife had done something he could not undo the damage of. "You did what?" I said. I kept my voice level. I had promised myself, in the days leading up to that dinner, that I would not be the one who lost composure first. "I want to be clear that this was never about doubting anyone," Linda said, in the smooth, rehearsed cadence of someone who has practiced a speech in front of a mirror. "It was about understanding our family more fully, but I have to say, when the results came back, there were some things in Sophie's ethnicity breakdown that surprised me, given—" "Given what?" Michael said. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room in a way Linda's practiced cadence hadn't managed to. "Given the family she's part of," Linda said. And there it was, finally, out loud, after 5 years of doc photographs and missing Christmas cards, and one paragraph in a 400-year binder. The actual accusation, spoken aloud in front of the entire family, at a dinner Linda had spent months planning specifically so she could say it in the most damaging possible setting. I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm simply saying that when I looked at the regional breakdown alongside what we know of the Whitfield line, there were some inconsistencies I thought the family deserved to understand. There was a long, terrible silence. I felt Sophie's small hand find mine under the table, not because she understood what was happening, but because children are exquisitely sensitive to the emotional temperature of a room even when they can't parse the words, and I squeezed her hand and forced myself to breathe. "Linda," Robert said, from the end of the table, his voice unusually sharp for a man who spent most family gatherings saying and letting his wife run the room. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Robert. I'm presenting information." "You tested a 4-year-old's hair without her parents' consent," I said, "to try to prove she doesn't belong in this family, and you're calling that presenting information?" "I tested everyone," Linda said, a note of defensiveness creeping into the practiced smoothness now. "It wasn't targeted. It was part of a broader genealogical project. I tested myself. I tested Robert. I tested Gerald. You tested Michael too," I said. "Off a water glass. Without asking him." That landed. I watched it land, watched Linda's composure flicker for the first time all evening, a small crack in the performance, and I understood that she hadn't expected us to know that particular detail, hadn't expected the water glass to ever come up. "I don't know what you're talking about," Linda said, but her voice had lost its smoothness, and everyone at the table could hear it. Michael stood up. He hadn't planned, I think, to stand. It wasn't part of our plan, such as it was. But something in him had reached a limit, and he stood and reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out 3 folded pages, printed from his own BioRoots account, the results he'd been carrying with him, unopened to anyone but me, for 11 days. "You tested me," he said, "and it turns out you were right that there was something to find in this family's DNA. You just found the wrong person." Since this story started circulating among friends and family, and eventually further than that, in the strange way personal stories sometimes travel once you've told them enough times at dinner parties and in group chats, I've gotten a lot of the same questions over and over, and I thought I'd answer a few of them here, because I suspect anyone reading this far into my story might be wondering the same things. The first question people always ask is whether I would have done anything differently, looking back, in how I handled Patricia during those first 9 years, before any of this came out. And the honest answer is yes, though maybe not in the way people expect. I don't regret being patient. I don't regret trying to build a relationship with my mother-in-law instead of writing her off after our very first dinner together. What I regret is not trusting my own instincts sooner, that quiet, persistent feeling I had, even in the early years, that something about Patricia's coldness toward me didn't add up, that it felt less like garden variety difficulty and more like something being protected. I dismissed that instinct for years, telling myself I was being paranoid or overly sensitive, when in reality, some part of me had correctly sensed that there was a locked room in Patricia's history that she was working very hard to keep everyone away from. I wish I'd trusted that instinct enough to ask more direct questions, sooner, even if I never could have guessed the actual answer. The second question people ask is whether Daniel and I ever considered legal action against Patricia for testing Grace's DNA without consent. We looked into it, briefly, in the weeks after we first discovered what she'd done, consulted with a lawyer friend of ours just to understand what our options actually were. The reality, we learned, is that the legal landscape around unauthorized genetic testing of a minor by a family member is murky at best, particularly when no medical decision was made based on the results, and no financial or legal harm resulted from the test itself. We could have pursued something, potentially, but we ultimately decided against it, partly because we didn't think a courtroom battle would give us anything meaningful that a direct, honest reckoning within the family couldn't, and partly because Daniel, even in his anger, didn't want to be the reason his parents' marriage became a matter of public record. I understand people who would have made a different choice here. I don't think there's one right answer. The third question, and probably the one I get most often, is simply, how did you forgive her? And I want to be honest that forgive isn't quite the right word for where I ended up, even a year and a half after everything happened. What I did wasn't a single act of forgiveness, delivered all at once in a dramatic scene. It was something slower and less complete than that. An ongoing decision, renewed almost daily in small ways, to let Patricia's changed behavior count for something, to notice the effort she was actually putting in rather than holding her permanently to the worst thing she ever did. I don't think I've fully forgiven her, if forgiveness means the memory no longer has any weight at all. I still remember viscerally the feeling of reading that lab report at my kitchen table, the particular kind of violation of realizing someone had taken my sleeping daughter's hair for a purpose I never would have consented to. That memory hasn't disappeared, and I don't expect it ever fully will. But I've made room, alongside that memory, for a version of Patricia who is actively trying to become someone different, and I've decided that both things can be true at once. She did something unforgivable, and she is also, genuinely, working to become someone worth trusting again. Holding both truths at the same time has been harder than either one alone, but it's also felt more honest than picking just one and ignoring the other. I think, if there's one thing I'd want anyone reading this to take away from my family's strange, difficult year, it's that the people who seem the most obsessed with judging others, the most committed to some rigid standard of who really belongs and who doesn't, are very often the people most afraid of failing that same standard themselves. Patricia's cruelty toward me for 9 years wasn't really about me at all. It was fear, dressed up as pickiness, dressed up as old-fashioned family values, dressed up as concern for bloodlines and resemblance and belonging. Underneath all of it was a woman terrified that she herself might not measure up to the very standard she was so eager to apply to everyone else. I don't think that makes her cruelty acceptable. But understanding it changed how I carried the weight of those 9 years, and I think that understanding is worth something, even if it doesn't erase the harm that came before it. I have never, before or since, seen a room go as silent as that dining room went in the seconds after Michael said that sentence. Even the caterer's assistant clearing plates from the sideboard froze mid-motion, sensing, the way you sense a change in barometric pressure, that something was happening that she should not be witnessing. "What are you talking about?" Linda said. It wasn't quite a question. Her voice had gone thin. "I did a test of my own," Michael said. "After Danny Haynes messaged me on LinkedIn asking if I knew why BioRoots had flagged the two of us as a close match. Probable half-siblings. I didn't understand it either, at first. I thought it had to be an error, or someone else's mistake. So I ordered my own kit, and I did it properly, in my own name, and I paid extra to get the results fast, and I got them back 11 days ago." He set the pages down on the white tablecloth, next to the dessert plates, next to the coffee cups Linda had set out with the good china. "Danny Haynes and I share 1,743 centimorgans of DNA. That's not a distant cousin. That's not a coincidence. That's a half-sibling match. And Danny's only parent besides his mother is Gerald." Every head at the table turned in a slow, horrified wave toward Gerald, who had gone very quiet, his wine glass still in his hand, his face doing something complicated. Confusion first, and then, as the sentence fully landed, something that looked almost like grief arriving early, ahead of understanding, the way grief sometimes does. "That's not—" Gerald started, and then stopped, and looked at Robert. And I watched. In that look, 40 years of friendship suddenly recontextualizing itself in real time behind his eyes. "Robert, I want you to know, I never knew anything like this. If this is true, I had no idea. None. You have to believe me." "I believe you," Robert said quietly, and it was the strangest thing. Of everyone at that table, Robert was the calmest, or seemed to be, in that first terrible minute. And I would understand later that his calm wasn't peace. It was shock. The particular stillness of a man whose entire understanding of his own life had just been rewritten in front of him and who had not yet caught up to what that meant. He turned to Linda. "Is it true?" Linda didn't answer right away. She sat back down, slowly, the folder of BioRoots printouts still in front of her, the ones about Sophie, the ones she had spent the whole dinner preparing to weaponize, now completely irrelevant, swept aside by a truth she had apparently never expected to surface, not after 39 years, not after all the careful maintenance of a story she'd built her entire identity around. "Linda," Robert said again, and this time his voice cracked. Just slightly, the first real crack I had ever heard in it. "Is it true?" "It was one time," Linda said finally, and her voice, when it came, was smaller than I had ever heard it, smaller than the voice of the woman who had spent 5 years scrutinizing my daughter's face for evidence of illegitimacy. "It was 39 years ago. We were having problems, Robert. Real problems. You were traveling constantly for the business. We barely spoke for months at a time. And Gerald was there. And it was a mistake. One mistake. And I have spent every single day since then trying to make sure it never mattered. Trying to make sure Michael had the best life a Whitfield could have. And it worked. Robert. It worked for 39 years. He had your name and your love and every advantage this family could give him, and none of that has ever been untrue just because of one night. You let me raise a son for 39 years without telling me he might not be mine, Robert said. He wasn't shouting. I think if he had shouted, it might have been easier for everyone in the room, easier to categorize, easier to understand as a simple explosion of anger that would burn itself out and leave something calmer behind. Instead, his voice stayed low and even and utterly devastated, and that was so much worse to witness. You let me love him without telling me there was a chance to make peace with, one way or another, 39 years ago, instead of finding out at a dinner table in front of the whole family because you were trying to prove something about a 4-year-old's hair. Robert, he is your son, Linda said, and for the first time all evening her voice broke completely, tears coming fast now, no performance left in it at all. In every way that matters, he has always been your son. I never wanted you to find out this way. I never wanted you to find out at all. Then why? I said. And I want to be honest, I hadn't planned to speak again, but the question came out of me before I could stop it. Why would you spend 5 years testing whether my daughter belonged in this family, when you were sitting on a secret this big about your own son? How could you look at a 4-year-old's hairbrush and see something worth investigating while hiding this? Linda looked at me, and for just a moment, before the tears and the shame closed back over her face, I saw something else there. Something I think had been the actual engine underneath 5 years of doc photographs and empty binder pages and missing Christmas cards. Something she probably could not have said out loud even if she'd wanted to, because I don't think she'd ever fully admitted it to herself. She had spent 39 years terrified of exactly this outcome, terrified that someday, somehow, the truth about Michael would surface, that the bloodline she'd built her whole identity around policing in other people would turn out to be broken at its own root. And rather than face that fear directly, she had spent years projecting it outward, onto the one person in the family who was the easiest, safest target for it. A young mother from Bridgeport who didn't have the last name, the property, the 400 years of documented lineage to defend herself with. If Sophie could be proven not to belong, then belonging itself could remain a stable, knowable thing, a thing Linda could still control, even while her own claim to it had been built on a lie since before Michael was ever born. I don't say this to excuse her. I want to be very clear about that. Understanding why someone does something cruel is not the same as forgiving them for it, and I have never, in all the months since that dinner, felt anything close to forgiveness toward Linda for what she did to Sophie. But I did, sitting at that table watching her come apart in front of everyone, finally understand her, for the first time in 11 years, and understanding her made her smaller, somehow, not more sympathetic. A woman who had spent decades building an elaborate architecture of bloodline and belonging specifically to keep anyone, including herself, from ever looking too closely at the crack running through the foundation. I want to end this story with a scene, because I think it says more than any explanation I could offer about where things eventually landed for our family. This past Thanksgiving, almost exactly 2 years after I first found that envelope on my kitchen counter, we hosted the holiday at our own house for the first time. Daniel, Grace, my mother, Gerald and Patricia, Lauren and her family, all crowded around a table I'd extended with 2 extra leaves to fit everyone comfortably. It was the first time in our marriage that Patricia had come to my house, to my table, without a single pointed comment about the seating arrangement or the menu or the way I'd chosen to set the table. Grace, now 7 and thoroughly obsessed with dinosaurs again after a brief mermaid interlude, insisted on saying grace herself before we ate, something she'd learned at school and had been practicing for weeks. She stood on her chair, hands folded with exaggerated solemnity, and thanked God for turkey, for her stuffed rabbit bun, for her parents, and then, without any prompting from either Daniel or me, for Grandma Pat and Grandpa Gerald, because they're the best grandparents in the whole entire world, even in the whole universe, including outer space. I looked across the table at Patricia in that moment and saw her eyes fill with tears she didn't try particularly hard to hide, and I felt something in my own chest catch too, because 2 years earlier, sitting at that same kitchen table with a shaking DNA report in my hands, I could never have imagined arriving at an afternoon like this one, a woman who had once treated my daughter's very existence as evidence to be cross-examined, now crying happy tears because that same daughter had declared her, unprompted, one of the best grandparents in the entire universe. After dinner, while the men cleared plates and Lauren's kids chased Grace around the backyard in the last of the autumn light, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen and asked, quietly, whether I was doing all right with everything, whether having Patricia in my home, at my table, still felt strange after everything that happened. It does. Sometimes, I told her honestly. There are moments when I still feel the old wariness creep back in, especially around holidays, when the whole extended family is together, and I remember exactly how it used to feel, sitting at that first dinner 9 years ago, being sized up and found wanting before I'd even said 10 words. But mostly now, I just feel grateful. Not for what she did. I'll never be grateful for that. But grateful that the truth came out at all, even in the ugly, painful way it did. Because I think if it hadn't, we'd all still be living inside a lie that was slowly poisoning every relationship in this family, one small cruelty at a time, and none of us would have understood why. My mother squeezed my hand and said something I've thought about many times since. The families that survive things like this, she said, aren't the ones where nothing bad ever happens. They're the ones where, when something bad does happen, everyone involved is willing to actually look at it honestly instead of looking away. You did that. Daniel did that. Even Patricia eventually did that. That's rarer than you'd think, Em. Most families just bury things like this and let them rot quietly for another generation. I think about that conversation often now, especially on the days when Patricia calls just to talk to Grace about her day at school, her voice warm and genuinely curious in a way it never used to be, or on the evenings when Gerald and Daniel come back from their standing Thursday lunch looking lighter than they used to, laughing about something that happened at the diner, a father and son who chose each other, deliberately, decades ago, and are still choosing each other now. None of it erases what happened. I don't think it's supposed to. But it does prove something I didn't fully believe 2 years ago, sitting alone at my kitchen table with a stranger's laboratory letterhead in my shaking hands, certain that my family had just been permanently, irreparably broken by someone else's decades-old secret. That even the ugliest truths, once they're finally spoken out loud, can become the foundation for something more honest and more solid than the careful, polished lie that came before them. My mother-in-law secretly tested my daughter's DNA to prove she wasn't really family. In the end, the results she got back proved something else entirely. That the family she'd spent 34 years protecting had never needed protecting from an outsider at all. It had needed protecting from the fear she carried alone, in silence, for far too long. And once that fear finally had somewhere honest to go, for the first time in 3 decades, Patricia Whitfield finally got to stop running. I still don't know if I'll ever fully trust her the way I trust my own mother. Maybe that's all right. Maybe some relationships get rebuilt into something different rather than something identical to what existed before the damage, and maybe that's actually enough. What I do know is that when Grace runs into that living room now and throws her arms around her grandmother's neck without a single moment of hesitation, without that old wariness I used to notice in her small body years ago, I know that whatever this new relationship is, it's real. And after everything, that's more than I ever expected to get back. If you've made it this far, I imagine you might be someone dealing with a difficult mother-in-law of your own, or maybe a family secret you suspect is still buried somewhere, quietly shaping how the people around you behave in ways that don't quite make sense yet. I don't have a tidy piece of advice that applies to every situation, because families are messy and specific and rarely follow a script. But I will say this. If something about a person's behavior toward you feels disproportionate, feels like it's about something bigger than what's actually in front of you. Trust that feeling enough to keep asking questions, even quietly, even just to yourself. There was often something else going on underneath Patricia's coldness toward me, long before I ever found that envelope, and some part of me sensed it for years without having the language or the courage to say so out loud. I also want to say, to anyone who has ever been on the receiving end of a family member's unexplained suspicion, that it is not your job to shrink yourself down to fit inside someone else's fear. I spent years trying to be smaller, more agreeable, less threatening, hoping that eventually Patricia would simply run out of reasons to doubt me. What actually needed to happen was for her to face her own history honestly, and no amount of my own good behavior was ever going to make that happen faster. Some things are simply not ours to fix, no matter how hard we try, and I wish I'd understood that distinction years earlier than I did. Grace is 7 now, working her way through a school year full of dinosaur facts and reading levels, and the particular chaos of being a kid who has decided the world is endlessly interesting. She doesn't remember any of this. She was too young when it happened, and by the time she's old enough to ask questions about her grandmother's past, I suspect the story will have softened into something closer to family folklore than raw, recent history. Maybe someday I'll tell her the whole thing, the way I've told it here, so she understands the strange, complicated road her family walked to get to the ordinary, peaceful Thursday dinners we have together now. Or maybe I'll simply let her keep believing what she already knows to be true in her bones, that she is loved, completely and without condition, by every single person sitting around that table, blood or no blood, DNA report or no DNA report at all. Because that, in the end, is what this entire story taught me. Family was never really about the biology. It was about who shows up, again and again, choosing you deliberately, even after the truth comes out messier and more complicated than anyone expected. Gerald chose Daniel, 34 years ago and every day since. Daniel and I chose Grace, the moment she was born, and every single day after. And eventually, slowly, imperfectly, Patricia chose to stop running from her own fear long enough to finally choose us too. That's the whole story. Thank you for listening. The dinner ended the way you'd expect a dinner like that to end. Gerald left first, shaken, apologizing to Robert over and over on his way out the door, though he had nothing at all to apologize for, having been as blindsided as anyone in the room. Patricia took Chris and Amanda and Tyler home early, Tyler confused and asking why everyone was crying, Amanda giving me a look on her way out that I understood, later, to be the beginning of a genuine, if belated, apology of her own. An acknowledgement, unspoken that night but stated plainly a few weeks later over coffee, that she'd seen the favoritism toward Tyler over the years and had never said anything, and was sorry for that silence. Michael and Robert stayed in the dining room a long time after everyone else had gone, and I took Sophie upstairs to the guest room, read her a book, and sat with her until she fell asleep, grateful, in that moment, for every year of occupational therapy training that had taught me how to keep my own hands steady and my own voice calm for the sake of a child who needed calm around her, even when everything in me wanted to shake. Robert moved out 3 weeks later, not dramatically, not with lawyers immediately involved, just a quiet, methodical packing of a bag and a departure to a rental cottage near the lake house. The same lake where Linda had once arranged us all on a dock for a photograph that cut me and Sophie out of the frame. He needed time, he told Michael, not necessarily to end the marriage, though I think everyone suspected correctly that it would end eventually, but simply to sit with 39 years of his life recontextualized, to grieve a version of his own history he had believed in completely and had now lost. He and Michael spent a lot of time together that summer, more than they ever had before, actually. Long walks around the lake, long phone calls, a fishing trip Robert had never once suggested in Michael's entire childhood and now proposed almost immediately, as though he understood, on some instinctive level, that the biology didn't matter nearly as much as the making sure Michael knew it didn't matter. I remember Michael coming home from one of those lake walks and telling me, quietly, that Robert had said to him, "You have been my son every single day since the day you were born, and nothing on a piece of paper changes that. And I am sorry it took your mother's mistake to make me say that to you out loud instead of just assuming you knew it." Michael cried telling me that. I cried hearing it. It remains, of everything that happened that year, the one piece of the story I think about with something other than anger. Gerald, for his part, handled the revelation with the same steady decency he'd shown for as long as I'd known him. He didn't try to insert himself into Michael's life as a father, didn't push for some sudden reordering of relationships that Michael wasn't ready for. He simply said, the one time they spoke privately about it, that he would be honored to know Michael in whatever way Michael wanted, as much or as little as felt right, and that nothing about the truth of the biology changed the fact that Robert had done the actual work of raising him. It was, I think, the most generous possible response available to a man who had just learned, at nearly 70, that he had a second son he'd known and loved his whole life without ever understanding what he was to him. Danny Haynes flew out from Seattle a few weeks later, and he and Michael met for the first time as brothers rather than distant family acquaintances, an oddly gentle, careful meeting over coffee that Michael described to me afterward as, like meeting someone you already know but have to learn all over again. They've kept in touch since. Danny came to Sophie's 5th birthday party that October, brought her a ridiculous, oversized stuffed animal, and she declared him cool, which, from a 5-year-old, is about as high a compliment as exists. The DAR application, as it turned out, collapsed entirely, and not just because of the scandal. The genealogist Linda had hired the year before had apparently flagged, quietly, before any of this came out, that Linda's own paternal line contained a documentation gap far more serious than the Sarah Coombs courthouse fire she'd spent a decade trying to paper over. Whether that gap was related to the affair or simply an unrelated coincidence of incomplete records, I never learned in enough detail to say for certain, and honestly, by that point, none of us had much appetite left for genealogical mysteries. The framed chart in the Whitfield front hallway came down sometime that summer. Michael told me his mother took it down herself, quietly, without comment, and never mentioned it again. As for Sophie's own test, the one Linda had taken her hair to run, the one that had started this entire unraveling, the results, when Michael finally pulled them from the account months later, showed exactly what any of us could have told Linda without spending $1,100 and violating a child's basic right to consent. Sophie was Michael's biological daughter. Full stop. No ambiguity, no asterisk. A completely unremarkable, entirely expected result buried in an ethnicity breakdown that simply reflected the fact that half of Sophie's genetic material comes from a woman whose family has lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut for 2 generations and traces further back to Guanajuato, Mexico, and Ponce, Puerto Rico, on different branches. A heritage exactly as real, exactly as legitimate, exactly as worth documenting in a family history binder as any Mayflower passengers, though Linda would spend the rest of her life, I suspect, never quite able to see it that way. People have asked me since I first started telling this story, what happened to the original lab reports themselves, that thin stack of paper that changed everything for our family in the span of one ordinary Thursday afternoon. Daniel kept them, for a while, tucked away in the same desk drawer where he'd found the second page. That day he called me home from work, with his voice gone thin and strange. Eventually, almost a year later, he took them out one evening, sat with them at the kitchen table the way he had the night everything started, and then, without any particular ceremony, fed them through our paper shredder, one page at a time. "I don't need to keep proof of any of this anymore," he told me afterward. "I know who my father is. I know who my daughter is. I don't need a laboratory to tell me either of those things ever again." I think about that moment often, more than almost any other part of this entire story, because it captures something I didn't fully understand when all of this began. Patricia had spent 34 years believing that the truth about a family lived in bloodlines, in genetic markers, in probabilities calculated to the 10th of a % by a laboratory in Columbus. She built her entire sense of who belonged and who didn't around that framework, and it made her cruel in ways she never fully reckoned with until the truth finally caught up to her. But the truth about our family, it turns out, was never sitting in a laboratory folder at all. It was sitting at our kitchen table, at Thanksgiving dinners, in the quiet, ordinary Thursday lunches between a father and a son who chose each other decades ago and kept choosing each other through every difficult year since. It was in the way Grace ran, without hesitation, into the arms of every single person who had earned her trust through years of simply showing up. Somewhere in the last 2 years, we all learned the same lesson, each of us in our own painful, roundabout way, that belonging was never something you could test for. It was something you built, one honest day at a time, and it was always, always worth more than whatever a piece of paper could ever prove. That's really the end of it now. Grace is upstairs asleep as I finish writing this, Bun Bun tucked under one arm, a half-finished dinosaur drawing still clutched in her other hand. Daniel is downstairs watching some documentary he'll fall asleep halfway through, the way he does most nights. And somewhere across town, Patricia and Gerald are probably doing the same thing they do most evenings now, sitting together in a quiet living room, two people who chose, eventually, after everything, to keep choosing each other too. I used to think the worst thing my mother-in-law could do to me was make me feel small at a dinner table. I was wrong about that, the same way I was wrong about so much else back then. But I was right about one thing all along, even when I didn't fully understand why. Something underneath her coldness had never really been about me. And now, finally, all these years later, I understand exactly what it was, and I've made my peace with it. As much peace as I think this story was ever going to allow. It's been a little over a year now since that dinner. Robert and Linda are divorced, quietly, without much drama beyond the drama that had already happened at that table. Robert lives near the lake full-time now, and Sophie spends most Saturdays with him, fishing off a small dock that isn't the same dock from that old 4th of July photograph, though it's close enough that I think about it every time I drop her off. He calls her my girl now, unprompted, in front of anyone, in a way he never quite managed to before all of this happened, and I don't know if that's guilt or grief or simple, overdue clarity. And honestly, I've stopped needing to know which. It's real, whatever caused it, and Sophie basks in it the uncomplicated way 5-year-olds bask in love that's finally being offered without hesitation. Linda and I have not repaired anything, and I don't know if we ever will. She sent a card, months after the dinner, an actual handwritten letter, longer than anything she'd ever written me before, apologizing, genuinely, I think, as far as I can tell, for the hair, for the years of small cruelties, for the binder, for all 31 items on a list I'd made years earlier that I don't think she ever knew the full contents of until that letter arrived. I appreciated the letter. I haven't fully forgiven her, and I'm not sure forgiven is even the right frame for what I'm working toward. What I want, mostly, is for Sophie to never again have to sit at a table while an adult who is supposed to love her unconditionally, quietly, weighs whether she counts. Linda sees Sophie now, occasionally, supervised, careful, a relationship still finding its new shape, and I watch it closely. And so far, it has been gentle in a way it never used to be. Michael and I are good. Better than good, actually. Something about surviving that year together, watching him choose, again and again, to stand up straighter in front of his own mother than he ever had before, rebuilt something between us that I don't think either of us realized had quietly worn thin over a decade of him apologizing for her instead of stopping her. He tells Sophie, most nights now, some version of the same thing, that she is a Whitfield and an Alvarez and entirely, completely herself, and that no test, no binder, no old ship from 1638 gets to decide that for her. She's 5. She mostly just wants to know if there's ice cream. But I think some of it is getting through anyway, the way the important things eventually do, even to children who are only half listening, busy as they are with the actual, unglamorous, ordinary business of growing up loved. I think about Linda sometimes, late at night, the way you think about weather systems that have already passed through and done their damage. I think about how much energy she spent, over so many years, trying to protect an idea of family so narrow it couldn't survive contact with an actual, breathing 4-year-old who didn't look quite the way she expected. And I think about the deep, sad irony sitting underneath the whole story. That the thing she was so afraid other people might discover about her family was never going to be found in my daughter's hair. It had been sitting quietly in her own for 39 years, waiting, the whole time, for someone to finally ask the right question. She spent 5 years trying to prove my daughter didn't belong to the Whitfield family. In the end, all that testing did was prove, once and for all, whose family Sophie has always unmistakably belonged to. Mine and Michael's, and her own, entirely her own, no asterisk required.